Good morning again, everyone. My presentation is titled Urban Inequality, Human Security, and Precarity Associated with Youth Migrants in Ghana. My name is Joseph Hassan. I'm based at the Center for Global Development and Sustainability in the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University in Massachusetts, USA. Or Boston, for those of us who may not necessarily be as familiar as it might be with the geography of Massachusetts. I'm only about 9 miles from Boston in the suburbs of Massachusetts. So my paper looks at migration of young people within Ghana, so focus on internal migration. And I have several objectives, but I will just highlight one or two in the interest of time. First, I would like to ascertain the impact of migration among young youth within the study sample, and then also compare that to those individuals who have not necessarily migrated. Internal migration in Ghana has increasingly become a part of what we consider as a livelihood or labor-seeking mechanism, where young individuals who are born or whose family are located in locations within the country where employment opportunities are not considered to be ideal, adequate, or available, move to other parts of the country seeking for prospects in terms of better opportunities. Sometimes it's education, sometimes children or youth migrate autonomously looking for employment. So this paper sought to or seeks to address that phenomena by comparing young individuals who migrate and those who did not or have not migrated within the same locale, and then to understand the experiences, opportunities, and also the challenges when it comes to employment and also labor dynamics, as well as issues relating to safety, security, and also well-being. We'll also explore the nature of and implication of labor activities and how this impacts on individuals' human security and, of course, their welfare. And then we also argue that migrants and migration have also been associated with crime, even from time at the political and the national level. But there hasn't been much discussion as regards how migrants or internal migrants also become victims of crime. So our study sought to examine that aspect as well. Not much is often discussed in the academic literature with regards to the experience of migrants when it comes to they being victims of one form of crime or the other. So I believe that it's not necessarily very clear with regards to the slides and being able to see this detail. So for each of the slides with data, I will just give a synthesis of what that slide contains, just to allow us to proceed more easily and also allow you to engage in regards to being able to follow the argument. So this slide highlights some key statistics with regards to the current economic state of Ghana and how that has spurred internal migration. So Ghana has recently, of course, moved up in its economic status. And for that matter, cost of living and then internal dynamics with regards to local economy have also, risen as a result of that. So for most people, these are very good indicators in terms of economic indices and with regards to economic growth, etc. But that also has impact in regards to when one has access or maybe does not have access to adequate or appropriate employment. So we use the Ghana Living Standard Survey 2012, 2013, the round 6, and then the round 7, that is 2016, 2017 for the data aspect of this study. We analyzed for the impact of migration internally over one's lifetime. We undertook logistic and linear regressions, including variables regarding origin of place, ethnicities of young migrants, and then also we control for various socio-demographic indicators, including gender, age, marital status, education, disability status, consumption, quintiles, etc., as well as living location with regards to residential location, whether it be rural, urban, and of course, to some extent, the districts where migrants are located. Youth, in regards to the definition of the Ghana Living Standard Survey, is individuals who are below the age of 35. So oftentimes between the ages of between the teenage years all the way to 34 are often classified as youth in Ghana. Okay, so with regards to our analysis and results, we observed that there is a large a propensity to migrate among youth in Ghana, and that is evidenced by the Ghana Living Standard Survey for both data sets that we analyzed, and that's for each region. With regards to the administrative region of Ghana, Ghana used to have 10 administrative regions, and very recently, by Act of Parliament, they've increased the administrative regions to 16. So some regions which were considered to be very large were subdivided so as to enhance democratic participation and also local governance administration. So currently, as I speak, the number of regional administrations have increased to 16. But this data, the two data sets were conducted using the previously established 10 administrative regions. So that is the basis for today's presentation. We notice that there are mobilities in terms of patterns within each of the 10 regions, as I explained, and that, of course, some regions tend to have more migrants than the other, and then there's a migration activity in terms of departure were higher in some particular regions than the other. The more developed, economically developed regions, of course, attracted more migrants, whereas the less developed regions, experience a greater degree of departure in that respect. Right. So with regards to the notion of poverty and the issue of probability of being poor in terms of one's nature of migration as compared to the same category of age or colleagues who are natives of the location that the young migrant is currently resident, we notice some degree of disparity. We notice that in the first data set of 2012-2013 of the Ghana Living Standard Survey, or round 6, as we call it, migrants were less likely to be poor compared to the non-migrant, except for youth from the Western, Central, Eastern, and Ashanti regions. We also observed that in the second round, round 7 of the data, some migrant youths became more likely to be poor compared to the non-migrants, especially for those who are coming from historically poor locations of the country. So that then implied that geographical location with regards to where one was born could impact on their propensity to succeed with regards to their migration. So the individuals who came from the northern regions of the country, Upper East, Upper West, etc., were displayed higher degree of poverty. Also, it was observed that some individuals or some particular ethnic groups, for example, the Mole or the Bani ethnic groups, the Brusi ethnic groups that are predominantly from the northern part of Ghana, again, exhibited higher propensity of being poor in spite of their migration. Again, with regards to the probability of being employed as part of one's migration experience, we observed that in general, youth became less employable in 2016, 2017 compared to the previous round of data set of 2012, 2013. The employability of some of the migrant youth groups decreased faster than others in that respect when we compare the two data sets. The migrants from the poorest regions and the poorest and ethnicities experienced the most significant drop in their relative employability rates. That was concerning because the government of Ghana, with the current government, argued and have also campaigned on the idea of expanding employability and as well as increasing the number of employable regions of the country. And of course, they argue that they're going to provide a factory in each district. So about 200 districts in Ghana, each factory was going to have each district was going to have a factory with the notion that they're going to create local employment in that respect. So having migrants being less likely to be employed in the latest round of the Living Standard Survey was concerning in that respect. Again, the argument associated with informal and informality is also very high in the social media and then also the public media in Ghana. But we observe that migrants increasingly had to work in the informal sector as compared to those colleagues who are non-migrants who tend to be able to access employment in the formal sector. And then we looked at the resources associated with the type of employment that young migrants were able to access within the particular employment that they found themselves in. And it was observed that most youth migrants working in the informal sector have better amenities compared to non-migrants in the formal sector. That was quite interesting because the informal sector has often been associated with lack of social welfare benefits and of course amenities in that respect. So access to job amenities improved in 2016-2017, although the degree to which one could be employable had decreased, with the exception of migrants from Greater Accra region, which is where the capital is. So we also looked at the notion of injury and the risk at work. We have often suspected that migrants, and often been argued in public media, that migrants tend to be subjected to undue labor, and of course, as a result, sometimes are often predisposed to risk and injury. So the probability of getting injured or facing risk at work declined between we compare the data from 2012-2013 to 2016-2017 for almost all migrants. Some migrant groups experienced less significant levels of decline and became relatively more prone to injury compared to their non-migrant counterparts. These surprisingly include migrants from richer regions and also ethnicities that were considered to be more dominant and not necessarily marginal in that respect. That was an interesting finding because we often associate injury and laborious work with migration, and of course, particularly for some individuals from some particular ethnicities or from other particular regions of the country that are more resource poor in that regard. And then we looked at the experience of abuse at work. And we also observed that non-migrants experienced less abuse in terms of those who have not migrated in 2016-2017 compared to the previous years. And conversely, some migrant groups experienced higher levels of abuse in 2016 compared to 2012-2013. These groups also experienced more abuse compared to their non-migrants. So migrants from the poorest region, again, always seem to experience the highest level of abuse at work. Which is sad, but seems to have a very important policy implication. Right, we'll skip to a few of these slides because of time and then come to the conclusion. So in conclusion, our paper argues that poor young migrants are progressing with regards to the slowest in terms of poverty reduction, employability, and informal sector involvement. And also in terms of the wider context of social policy, there seems to be a structured nature of the outcomes with regards to migrants vis-a-vis their ethnicity and also the geographical location of where they were born. For formal employment, migrants perform much better than non-migrants, of course, when we compared the two data sets, and they only decided, to migrate because, of course, when we asked of significant higher amenities, people often argue that in interviews that their argument was that they migrated because they wanted to have access to better amenities. And the migrants from historically wealthier regions and ethnicities were more prone to injury and some to a surprising extent, abuse, especially in the 2016-2017 data, compared to migrants from poorer regions or from poorer ethnicities. This provides a certain sense of contradiction when we often argue that my young individuals from maybe higher or well-respected ethnic groups tend to have better access in society. And of course, likewise, we argue that individuals from wealthier regions of the country will often have better access to maybe employment, etc. But the data does not necessarily seem to support this argument, which we thought were quite significant and also important in that regard. So I'll stop here and take any questions that panelists might have. If you don't have any question, I'm still fine. We can move on to our next presenter. So I'll be happy to check if there are any questions in that regard. Thank you. All right, so I don't see any indication of questions. So I will please invite, thank you very much for your attention and for listening to my presentation. I would like to invite our next presenter for this panel, Faith. Faith, I will kindly ask you to do the self-introduction so that we can learn about you and where you are located, etc., before you proceed with your presentation. So I'll go on, then I'll stop my presentation and then go on to upload your file.
Oh, okay. Good afternoon, everybody. It's afternoon my time now. My name is Shamiso Faith Waraizo Chigorimbo. I am at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. I am still in the early stages of my PhD, so I'm still in the first year where I'm finalizing my proposal. So I think you'll find my initial submission has kind of changed in terms of my follow-up presentation because it's still evolving as I've not yet finally, submitted it for ethical consideration within the university. So just to provide that background and just so you can understand the differences in the papers. So my research is intended to look at gender-based violence in undocumented migrant women in South Africa. And I had termed it the plight of migrant women's GBV vulnerabilities and their coping strategies. I must also provide a bit of background that I'm coming into the academic sector, into the academic space, having worked in the NGO sector for the past 5 years. So still getting very familiar with, the academic terminology and scholarly terms. Next slide, please. Okay, so my research is intended to be a qualitative investigation into the nature of GBV vulnerabilities amongst migrant women. As you know, South Africa has got really high rates of gender-based violence. It is reported that 1 in every 3 women in South Africa would have experienced GBV in some form in their lifetime. And with most recent, statistics and just what has been happening over this COVID period, there have been higher rates of femicide and gender-based violence within the country. My research intends to look at specifically migrant women's vulnerabilities to gender-based violence, because you'd find that when there are reports of homophobic attacks in South Africa, you do not hear of GBV experiences that migrant women face. So that is really what my research intends to look at. GBV is reported to be high in migrant women due to their vulnerabilities during the migration process and those they face at the country of destination. And this has been found out in a lot of studies within the global north, which have really interrogated just GBV vulnerabilities as migrants into the countries. I think the next slide, please. Thank you. Whilst investigating, my research would also look at, because they're such it would also like to analyze the gender inequalities and structural inequalities that migrant women face, also taking into mind that South Africa still also has quite significant structural inequalities in terms of just, having come out of apartheid, and it's a young democracy, just having been, recently got its democracy in 1994. So I'm cognizant of those gender inequalities and how they interact with specific economic, cultural, and social contexts that stress a prejudiced position against women. And then when it's if it's migrant women, then it adds to the journey of migration, and it heightens the risk of violence during migration and in the different processes of migration. So those are all part of the things I intend to look at and analyze. Next slide, please. Okay, the objectives of the research, which keep evolving, are to understand the heightened risks of GBV vulnerability, and of course to look at it specifically from the undocumented migrant women's perspective. Secondly, to determine the political, economic, and social structures and processes that render migrants vulnerable. This is key because South Africa has, in the region is known to have a progressive migration policy in terms of, African migrants coming into South Africa, in the sense that they're not sent into a detention camp. They're able to actually integrate into the society. They're able to look for work, and they're able to look for accommodation. So if they have had an existing network, it seems to be more, it's a best practice based, so to speak. Thirdly, I would like to investigate the available networks and those legal and social protection structures that are available, and how, if you're undocumented, they might make one vulnerable. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's just basically going back to the main definition and what I intend to look at. In terms of a theoretical framework, I'm very much interested in the structural violence framework, which is used to capture the social consequences of being an undocumented migrant, or just the social consequences of being a marginalized person within society. And these include, for migrants, usually fears of detention and arrest. And where gender-based violence is concerned, I like the idea of GBV as an unintended violence that comes through the existing institutional and structures, and hence there's a power imbalance, and there's just inequalities that exist. So, I mean, concept by Gal Tang on, structural violence. So that's really the main theoretical framework from which I'm going to try and analyze and look at the work. And of course, there'll be a few feminist ideologies within the lens through which I look at my research and society, and just the identity, the perceptions of identity of the migrant women themselves. If we can move to the next slide, please. Okay, so the research questions that are guiding the research are: how do structural and gendered inequalities affect undocumented migrants? In what ways do the legal status and lack of economic opportunities increase vulnerability? And what forms of protection can migrants, access and count on? I added this specifically because even within the formal structures of South Africa, if you're an undocumented migrant, in certain informal sectors, you can report abuses. So it's of interest to me to find out how that system works and the mechanisms that are in place to provide those type of protections. And then I was also interested to look at, how gender roles, migration and resettling, how they can make women more vulnerable. And then lastly, just the coping mechanisms, because I believe there are always coping mechanisms that people employ just to mitigate negative consequences. I think my last slide, please. Okay, so, all right. Okay, so the last one would be on my methodology. So of course I've had to relook the methodology because I haven't done the field work. So considering, this time of COVID, I realized that there are lots of things I need to, take into consideration in terms of my, my design, but I did intend to do one-on-one semi-directive interviews with, both documented and undocumented migrant women, as well as also key informants. And I intend to use, just the lived experience phenomenology in terms of guiding the way that I'll do my, my research on the ground. I think that's about it.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joseph. I think that's I'm trying to keep to the minutes. Yes. So I don't know if there are any.
You're well within time, so that's not a problem at all. Thank you so much. We have a raised hand, so I would like to look, and yeah, I think Marie has her hand up. Marie, can you please proceed with your question for Faith? Hang on, let's see if I can bring Marie up on the stage.
All right. So I was just wondering, well, thank you, first of all, for your presentation. It sounds like a very interesting PhD you're about to start. I wondered how, in the planning of your fieldwork, and then, with COVID-19, I suppose that's, I mean, as with many of us, it's forced us to, make different changes and reflect on the, the implications for the data that we collect, different types of things. I wonder what kind of reflections you had on that topic.
Okay. So I don't know. So in South Africa currently, especially with COVID-19, a lot of migrants have actually been requesting to be repatriated back to their countries of origin. And so it's been a situation where even undocumented migrants have come forward and said, look, we're actually not coping within this current context, so we'd like to go back, to our countries of origin. And also for me, that presents a challenge as a researcher, because I mean, some of the networks that I had that I was counting on getting into those communities to do my field research might not actually still be in South Africa when I actually have to go about doing my field research. So there are definitely a lot of considerations besides the health implications, which are just basically obviously to wash your hands, but wear a mask and protect yourself. But the reality has also been that people have been returning to their countries of origin, even if it meant that when they leave South Africa, they're getting like 5-year bans or 2-year bans. They've actually just been like, we're not surviving economically, so we would rather go back. So I have to take those. Definitely, there are lots of considerations to make now. So trying to just figure that part out. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Mary. Let's see if we have, yes, I see another question. Can we please raise our hands if we have questions for Faith so that we could take as many questions as possible because her presentation was well within time. Okay, so, well, I see that Neil posed a question, so we'll let Faith also respond to that, and then I'll probably as well.
Can I just say something, because that yes, question
please.
you put up was to you actually
earlier,
but I have asked a question to Faith, and it was just about, I was thinking about both the dynamics of being a migrant and gender dynamics, and whether or not these need to be addressed to some extent separately, analytically and methodologically, in order to understand a little bit more about how these situations unfold. I was just wondering whether you had thought about that.
Right, so Neil, are you posting this to me or to Faith, please?
That is to Faith.
Okay, please, Faith, you are welcome to respond.
Okay, so my connection went a bit, but yes, you're absolutely correct. I do have to look at the gender dynamics independent of the migrant dynamics. But what was critical for me in terms of the question, which is why it keeps evolving, is that I'm interested in the undocumented migrant women's lived experiences, because I realize that there are lots of intersects, the fact that they're women, the fact that they're also migrants, and then of course there's the structural economic factors as well. So I'm trying to, which is where my challenge comes in, because I sometimes am all over the place, and then sometimes I'm trying to be completely focused. Yeah, you're right to ask me to, I do have to look at those different dynamics and find a way that they all, gel together into a focused research, PhD research. So I'm battling a bit with that, but I'm hoping to have made headway soon. And yeah, have a more focused question and outline. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Neil, for your excellent question. Right. So I don't see any additional questions, but I have one of my own, so I think I can ask. What are your next steps, please, in terms of the research trajectory and your, again, given the circumstances we live in now?
Okay. So given the circumstances we now, I have a 4-week deadline to present my paper to the ethical body. So it's definitely a work in progress currently. So I'm in the next 4 weeks, I submit it for ethical review, and then I wait for, they've got a timeline of 2 months in which I must then hear the outcome if, I can proceed or if I still have to, make further corrections and the like. But because I also am in the NGO sector, the reality on the ground hasn't stopped, which is why I was able to speak to what's happening currently in the COVID situation. But in terms of the PhD, I'm really hoping to get, the go-ahead to proceed with the research.
Thank you so much. Any additional questions? We still have a minute or two for one more question. If there are any member of the audience or panelists would want to pose an additional question to Faith. Right, Faith, I don't see any additional questions. So I would like to thank you all. Thank you very much for your presentation, and please stand by, because if a question comes up later on after the first round, we may come back to you with some questions.
Okay. Thank you to everybody for listening to my presentation.
Great. So our next presentation will be Manasseh. So I'll bring Manasseh onto the podium.
Okay, my name is Manasseh Kudzai-Chweshe. I'm from the Sociology Department from the University of Zimbabwe. I'm a sociologist by training. So my presentation is going to focus on xenophobic attacks on Black African migrants in South Africa, and just focus on the question of leadership. Is it a crisis of leadership? Can leadership explain these attacks that keep on happening over time? So that is basically what my presentation is all about. Thank you very much for allowing me this opportunity to share my research with you. So I think we can go to the next slide and I can start going through the presentation itself. Basically, this presentation and this study and what I'm looking at grows out of the need to look at the literature that is coming out on xenophobia over the past 15 years in South Africa and Southern Africa in general, per se. There have been many explanations and many debates around this question. But for me, one of the interesting issues that keep coming back is the issue of how the ANC government, the African National Congress government that took power in 1994 after apartheid was abolished in South Africa, he has also been complicit in many ways in xenophobic attacks against Black Africans. And note that when we look at xenophobic attacks against foreigners in South Africa, it is mainly concentrated on Black African migrants, documented and undocumented. And I'll try to explain in terms of the various spaces in which even those with papers, even those that are legal, also face attacks within these spaces. Even those that are also in different classes, like Tendai Mtawarira, who is a rugby player, there's also had to face xenophobic attacks. Some of it also state perpetrated and perpetrated by state actors, and how this has also shifted the question in terms of understanding how leadership is central to these attacks. Because political will ultimately is required if these attacks are to be kept. And one of the interesting issues also in literature is that scholarly studies tend to focus on the xenophobic attacks that happen and lead to displacement and violence. But the everyday practices of xenophobia or prejudice that Black foreigners face in terms of access to housing, in terms of being troubled by the police or in other spaces, is often ignored or often not very much put to the forefront. So I begin the presentation by focusing on this period that we're in, the COVID-19 period, and understanding how political statements by political leaders in themselves can often lead to specific issues and specific fears from foreigners. This is a quotation from the Minister of Finance at the moment, Tito Mboweni, from South Africa. He says that when he returned to South Africa from exile in 1990, 8 out of 10 workers that returns were South African, but now almost 100% are non-South Africans. And he's saying that in the new economy that follows after COVID, any establishment that wants to operate has to ensure that they've got more South African workers or South Africans working in their establishments. And this is a critical question. That one of the key questions where foreigners are attacked has always been about foreigners are taking they're taking our jobs. So opportunities, they're taking opportunities away from South Africans. And later on, I'll also relate to a different type of leadership from the Economic Freedom Front, Julius Malema, who tries to debunk these issues and says that, no, the issue with Black South Africans and the lack of wealth and the continued poverty for the majority has nothing to do with foreigners per se, but really in terms of understanding how capital and property is owned and controlled within post-apartheid South Africa is very important, because in as much as South Africa is shifted, there are so many other continuities with apartheid. Can we go to the next slide? So generally, the introduction of the central argument. The central argument is that over the past 10 years, South Africa has experienced periodic episodes of internal turmoil, which will describe xenophobic attacks on Black foreigners from other countries, which has led to deaths, beatings, displacement, right? And there's been many explanations of this phenomenon, but it is important to highlight the role of leadership in explaining the drivers and responses to these attacks, right? So this research traces how leadership within the South African context mediates questions around race, poverty, citizenship, gender, belonging in what I would term a later apartheid context. I wouldn't say it's post-apartheid because some of the infrastructure, especially in the economic sector of apartheid, has remained, where you get a sense. Some scholars have actually described the South African space or South African economy as a form of a cappuccino society. You know, a cappuccino, the coffee, where you've got a whole mass of brown at the bottom, then there is the white cream on top, then there's a sprinkling of brown at the top. So there, a few South Africans, especially the political elites that have made it in post-apartheid, but wealth is still mainly firmly in the hands of white capital. And this poses problems in terms of transforming the economy itself, and issues of corruption and mismanagement of the economy and things like that do not really help in the in terms of allowing a transformative society. So there are scholars, especially at WITS, like Landau, that have highlighted that foreigners in South Africa are victims of discrimination in everyday lives at the hands of government officials, the police, banks, private companies, and even private organizations that are contracted to manage the detention and deportation. Can we have the next slide, please? Right. So within the historical background are some things that I've already highlighted in terms of the long history of apartheid, where South Africa is these two seemingly opposite sides, where it developed along racial lines, and the majority of Black people have a lack of opportunities, even post 1994 when apartheid ended. And as I highlighted, that the economic disparities have actually been described as a cappuccino society. And this has led to a lot of economic anxiety for the majority of Black people. And this has been seen in terms of service delivery, protest, high rates of crime and violence across the space. South Africa, in terms of crime and crime statistics, it's actually very high. And you've got also endemic poverty and high unemployment rates, especially among young Black people, right? So this continued racialized society itself is actually festered these notions of xenophobia, and this vicious cycle of xenophobic attacks can be explained by some of these factors that we have. I know right now I'm just sort of scaring through hurriedly over these complex issues, but basically it's providing an overview of my discussion and what I'm looking at. Can I have the next slide, please? right? In terms of defining xenophobia, I think generally it's any subtle or openly negative behaviors, such as dehumanizing remarks and negative stereotypes, and also more pronounced actions such as violence, harassment, discrimination against foreigners. So these attitudes and prejudices that reject, exclude, and often vilify people based on their perception that they're outsiders or they're foreigners or they don't belong are very, very important in terms of understanding xenophobia. This mistrust and fear of foreigners. And part of it is, as you will see, in terms of some of the statements by political leaders in South Africa and how they demonstrate or how they try to justify some of the actions of what happens. For example, Somalians are very enterprising and they've been successful in terms of what they call spaza shops in specific low-income communities in South Africa. One of the ministers was actually saying that Somalians cannot continue to be successful without teaching Black South Africans the secrets of their trade. So things like that will highlight some of this fear and mistrust of foreigners. Can we have the next slide? Right. So here I will not dwell much, but just to say that in terms of the various attacks, you will see how different types of leadership and political leadership, even traditional leadership, has been in many ways central. Like in April 2015, there were statements by the Zulu king, Godwin Zwelithini, who accused foreigners of fueling, of talking about foreigners and saying that they should go back to their countries, which led to an upsurge of xenophobic attacks. So in many ways, some of these attacks are directly linked to statements by political or traditional leaders or influential people within society. So you're beginning to see more and more some of how there is a distinct, links between leaders or leadership statements to these xenophobic attacks. But just to say that by 2018, 62% of South Africans viewed immigrants as a burden on society. And this is also fueled. Later on, I will discuss how the media itself, in many ways, fuel some of these descriptions of foreigners invading South Africa and things like that. And this paints a picture where there's a lot of mistrust, where Black South Africans are actually now seeing other Black migrants as enemies, as people that are after their job and are actually a burden to them, and also look at them as the ones that are causing crime. Can we move to the next slide so that I can quickly finish? Seeing my time is almost running out. Right. So now to the crux of the debate itself in terms of understanding how leadership in many ways feeds into this. The work of Neo Cosmos is also very instrumental in understanding how xenophobia has become institutionalized within the South African state itself. How the political ideology and the political statements of political leaders is also very instrumental in understanding the political will to actually guard against xenophobic attacks. So Neo-Cosmos argues that state discourses of xenophobia is based on how various arms of government, from politicians, police, detention camps, and even army, all emphasize the message of invasion by illegal migrants since the 1990s. So you will find that this is the message within the state, that illegal migrants are invaders. They are coming to South Africa. They are causing problems. So if in many ways this is the state position and all arms of the state behave in this way, you will get to a position where actually the police itself becomes problematic for illegal migrants. They now see illegal migrants as mobile ATMs, and they are paying them every month to be left alone and things like that. Right. So there's all these inflammatory stereotypes and unsubstantiated information that is out there in terms of the South African media, the South African state, which in many ways excuses and explains brutality against foreigners. So the South African citizenship post-apartheid has been reduced, according to Nyamjo, to issues of indigeneity, and this has been formalized by legislation. They are outsiders and insiders, as Nyamjo would say. And this notion has been built by this notion that South African is exceptional. And in many ways, South Africa is exceptional when you're looking at some of its neighbors in terms of its economic prowess and its economic might, which is why many illegal migrants are actually flooding, in many ways also the term that they use, flooding to South Africa. But it creates this notion that this is ours and these outsiders are coming to take it away from us. So it builds these notions within even the state apparatus. So I think I'll go to the next slide and maybe finish off with that. Right. This one is on the media and how the media continuously perpetrates these stereotypes and perpetuate, right? And if you read some of the works of some of the scholars that focus on this, they actually highlight two things: that for the ANC government, they want this notion of the foreigner as the enemy, as the invader, to explain away some of the things that they have been unable to deliver to the black masses that they promised after apartheid. But also for white capital, especially white capital that controls the press, they would also want that narrative to take hold, that it is the foreigners, it is those outsiders that are coming and causing problems to the black majority, and not the economic infrastructure itself, which is still in many ways controlled by white capital, which has not transformed itself to ensure that there is a democratic share of national wealth. So there are these competing narratives in terms of the outsider now, the foreigner, becomes a scapegoat for the problems that South Africa is missing. The next slide, please. Yeah, this is now the new South African line. South African presidents from Thabo Mbeki to Jacob Zuma and now to Cyril Ramaphosa have all in many ways tried to say that xenophobia does not exist. It's not hatred for black Africans. It doesn't happen. What is actually happening, what you are seeing now, is actually criminal elements, criminal activity, right? Naledi Panda, who was Foreign Affairs Minister around 2012, sums it. I do not believe we are, as the people, xenophobic. In fact, our statistics on asylum seekers and registration of refugees indicate South Africa is fully responsive to its human rights obligations, which is very true, right? Is South Africa is fully responsive in terms of its policies and things like that. But in terms of being xenophobic and the attacks that happen, you will find that in many ways, politicians have been saying that it's not xenophobia. As Mbeki said, there isn't anything like that. What you are actually seeing are criminal acts by criminal elements, and this poses serious problems in terms of grappling with the situation. Because understanding the problem first and accepting that we have a problem is the first step for leaders to actually propose solutions to it. But if they're in denial in terms of what is happening, then it becomes a problem. My last slide. So I'll just finish off with this slide, which shows some of the statements by ANC leaders or by leaders in political spaces that relate to attacks or xenophobic attacks that happen to people. Like in 2015, in 2019, attackers were actually saying that the speech by Cyril Ramaphosa, who was running for when they were campaigning for the election in terms of whatever, it actually in many ways led to them cracking down on foreigners, because the president had said something around combating illegal migration. So illegal migration becomes a trope that political actors use in terms of campaigning.
Hello, I think we've lost Manasseh's presentation and connection. So I think he's coming back. Hello, Manasseh. Yeah, something happened. So can you wrap up, because your time is up, please? I was trying to also draw your attention.
All right, so let me just stop there and just say that leadership in terms of political leadership, political leadership, is critical in understanding the xenophobic attacks that happen on Black Africans, and to find solutions to that problem would require leaders themselves understanding and accepting the role that they've played over time in terms of this phenomenon within South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manasseh, for that exciting presentation. I will open the panel at this point for questions, comments, and of course, discussion. Please, if you have a question, kindly post it or raise your hand, and I will bring you up the podium. Rowan, I appreciate your assistance in this regard. Just because, yes, of course. Marie, you have.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Manasseh, can you hear her?
Yes, I can hear you.
Wonderful. Good. Thank you, Manasseh, for this fascinating presentation. Xenophobia and stereotyping in South Africa, very, very interesting. And you've spoken a lot about how migrants are met with acts and practices of xenophobia. But I wonder how the migrants then also see themselves and position themselves within South Africa, the fact that they're met with this stereotyping.
Okay, thank you, Marie, for that question. That is an interesting question, which will be interesting also for Shamiso as she does here, as she starts her PhD, because she is now looking at the narratives of the lived experiences of the migrants themselves. But reading in terms of literature, because I wasn't focusing on that particular question, but reading in terms of literature, in terms of how migrants see themselves, there have been studies that have looked, and also documentaries also that have looked at how migrants have responded to xenophobic attacks and how they position themselves within this space. Around 2015, there's been a change in how migrant communities are actually responding to this. They've also become militant in many ways, that they are actually also meeting violence with violence in terms of if they are attacked, they are also organizing themselves to attack back and things like that. But in many ways, most of them find ways to survive within the structure that is there. And the structure, even where the police allow for bribes, is actually in many ways, works for some migrants who have no papers. If you're going to ask me for the bribe, then that's okay. You're not actually arresting me and detaining me. So they find ways to survive and have all these coping strategies that they have in terms of the situation that they find themselves in. Even within violence, right? When violence happens, they will seek shelter. They will run away. They are displaced, but they will find ways to rebuild it and restart their lives. Very rarely do you see. It's only now with COVID that we're seeing. Like in Zimbabwe, now we're seeing hordes and hordes of people coming back because now with COVID, the industries have closed, spaces like restaurants have closed, so people do not have anywhere to work. So if they can't work, they can't survive. That's why now they are resorting to come back. But as long as there is spaces where they can actually go back to work and do work, they will find ways to do that, which is why now the Minister of Finance is saying that for companies to reopen, you need to show us that you're not going to employ foreigners, because companies are still going to find this cheap labor and utilize it. So they'll find ways to cope with the circumstances that they find themselves under.
Thank you
for the great question, and thanks for the excellent answers. I will bring up the next question being posed. I will bring up Raji and then followed by Neil. So Raji, can you please pose your question to Manasseh?
Yeah, thanks so much. Good day to everyone. Manasseh, I really appreciate your presentation. It's an excellent one, at least going to how the leaders in South Africa play a significant role in xenophobia. But having said that, I will want us to look at the issue of xenophobia from the historical background of apartheid, looking at the role that the relationship between the Black South Africans and the whites in South Africa play, and how that results to xenophobia, I was just thinking that is it not possible that it is because of the historical genesis of the relationship that has taken place between the so-called black and the white in South Africa that is really informing and influencing the idea of xenophobia now? Because if you look at it, majority of the economic control in South Africa are in the hands of the so-called whites. So is it not possible that maybe the blacks are afraid that even the so-called black foreigners that are coming in are coming to also treat them the way the whites have treated them in the past and as and are still treating them up to the moment? Aside genesis of the relationship between the white and the black.
Hello.
So Manasseh, Raji, your connection seems to be breaking. So I think I will ask you to pause so that with your excellent questions, so Manasseh can at least start the response.
Okay.
Thank you, Raj, for your question. As I said, I tried to outline how the different debates within xenophobia or xenophobia in explaining xenophobia in South Africa relate to this question of the history of apartheid and how now South Africa is a community or a society where the vast control of the economy is still with white capital, and how white capital itself, through its control of the media, has tried to perpetuate the idea that it is the black foreigner who is coming in to steal your jobs, to do all these things, so that people will not question, right, the control of it. South Africans right now, as Malema says, why are you worried about a Nigerian or a Zimbabwean who is working a low-income job in a restaurant? Worry about the person who owns the restaurant. Who owns the restaurant? Who owns the real estate? Right, rather than the person who's working at minimum wage for that. So this is the question that goes around and around in terms of understanding this relationship between how migration relates to apartheid. But even within the apartheid system itself, you'll find that the apartheid system, when you look at Southern Africa, especially the gold mines that built Joburg, what we call Wenera, it was also migrant labor from Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Malawi that was working within these mines. So before the apartheid itself allowed black migrants to come to provide cheap labor, and this has continued post-apartheid in terms of white capital wanting this cheap labor to come within the systems. But now the problem is where you are now trying to understand and to link it to understanding how black South Africans now are in terms of responding to this. And the migrants who are problematic are never white, right? It's only black Africans, right? They're the ones that cause crime, and they're the ones that do this. But white foreigners, no, they're okay, right? So there. I think it's a complex question. I don't have a straight up answer, but just to say that there is really a relationship between apartheid and xenophobia.
Thank you so much for the excellent question and the great answer. Our next question is being posed by Neil. So we'll take Raj off the podium and then Neil will come up the podium. Give me a second, Neil. Yes, okay. Thank you.
It's okay. I'm used to being censored. But anyway, a fascinating presentation. Very, very good. When I saw your first quote, it reminded me when I kind of talked to quite a lot of people around Johannesburg working in restaurants, and they all told me that they came from Zimbabwe. A lot of them came from Zimbabwe, some from Malawi. They received no pay. They only received the tips that they received. And I mean, this is just to reinforce your argument that it is the owners of the restaurant who are kind of maximizing extremely cheap or whatever costless labor, in fact. I also spent some time in the township Tembisa, which I think is one of the largest townships. And I was actually with some women from Zimbabwe who had high education. They were teachers, in fact, but They had had to leave Zimbabwe because of the economic situation, et cetera, et cetera. And now they were in a situation where they had virtually no rights. They couldn't access health. They had great difficulty accessing housing at extortionate rates, et cetera. But this brings me to a comment come question, and I have to be brief because I'm taking time from our own, I'm not careful. Is xenophobia enough? In 2012, I heard a speech made by Trevor Manuel, who was, I think, planning minister at that stage. Mm-hmm. And he actually said that it was now, at that stage, about 18 years, whatever, since apartheid had formally ended, and what had we achieved? At some stage, we have to take responsibility ourselves for the situation that we have ourselves today. 2 weeks later, Zuma made a speech at the ANC Congress when he said, the problems of today are still rooted in apartheid. And this comes back to your point about leadership. So if you're going to bring about change, and that's a political process, not just a question of identifying the economic mechanisms which are being used here. If you're going to bring about change, where do you see that change coming from? How can, shall we say, the politics of change emerge from the current political nature of South Africa? I know that's a big question and a difficult one, but it's one which has troubled me for a long time.
So Manasseh, a quick interjection. Neil, this is a brilliant question. Manasseh, you can proceed as you can. We'll be able to revisit this question maybe in the afternoon as well after the second session, if Neil is back on. I just want to make sure you don't feel that you have to finish everything. Okay. So,
okay, just remember it, and we can come back to it.
Take a bite, and we'll come back to it because it's a very interesting and important one.
And the big one also. Yeah. All right. Okay, so Neil, I don't know where to start. This is a very big question, but my short answer is that it is within the youth of South Africa to really just focus on a new transformative system, because the system that is there now is not working. It simply is not working. The corruption, the mismanagement, the issues that are emerging within the ruling elite right now, it's something else. Part of the ANC Presidium, from the president himself and his vice also, they all have cases and issues that they have to answer that they haven't answered in terms of their own economic mismanagement and issues that have happened in the past. So I don't know where to start, really, but I think we can continue to discuss in terms of what can be done in the future. Thank you.
All right, then. Thank you very much, Neil, for your excellent question. And Manasseh, thank you for all the fabulous responses to all the questions. So, Neil, you stay on the podium. Neil and Marie are next with regards to our presenters. I think that normally we are allowed only 4 people on stadium, so I can take myself off the podium. So we'll take Manasseh off the podium, of course. Oh yes, we should be able to bring Marie then. Yeah, so we'll bring Marie up on the podium. Where is Marie? Yes, please. Yes, so bring Marie up the podium, and then you can proceed, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Joseph, we have sort of timed our presentation to almost coming up to 20 minutes. I hope that's okay.
Sure, that's fine. Yes, that's okay. Don't worry. Yeah.
Okay. So yes, my name is Marie, and with me is also Neil. We are both from the Danish Institute of International Studies in Copenhagen, and the title of our presentation today is Governing Climate Mobility in Ghana and Ethiopia. Next slide, please.
Okay, the slide went off, so I'm going to bring it back on. Okay. Right, thank you. Is that the right slide?
Yes, that's it. Yes, thank you. So Governing Climate Mobility is actually also the name of our research program. And that's a research program that's formed in partnership between Danish Institute for International Studies and the Center for Migration Studies at University of Ghana, and the Forum for Social Studies in Ethiopia. Now, I should stress that this presentation reflects a pre-fieldwork stage. So the program has only been running for 1 year, and we have not been able to do the main bulk of the fieldwork yet. But the research objective of the Governing Climate Mobility Program, or the GCM program, is to determine how different governance contexts affect mobility as a way to adapt to climate change. And to explore this, we make a comparative analysis of 2 areas in Ethiopia and 2 areas in Ghana. In both Ghana and Ethiopia, climate change directly affects the livelihoods and mobility of different population groups, but the 2 countries offer 2 very different governance contexts. We will come back to what is particularly interesting about these 2 countries later in this presentation. But theoretically, we stress the dimension of governance as a factor that mediates climate change impacts and migration practices. And this perspective breaks with approaches that seek a more causal link between migration and environmental factors. The central concept to the approach of the GCM program is our understanding of what we call climate mobility rather than climate change migration, and also what we understand by governance and what agency means in the interplay between governance, climate change, and mobility. We'll say a little bit more about this and then end this presentation with an example from Ethiopia that illustrates how we see these concepts connect in practice. So next slide, please. Yes, thank you. So first, use climate-induced mobility rather than climate change migration. Well, given the many migration scholars in the audience, I'm sure most of you would agree that it's often problematic to point to one single driver that makes people consider migrating. And with slow onset climate change, for instance, creating gradually more and more difficult conditions for doing farming, then singling out one trigger point for migration is even more difficult. So instead, climate change may be one of many factors leading to migration. Therefore, the wider context is also important to understand. And in our understanding, this wider context includes the influence of different governing bodies on how the individual or household chooses to or is forced to adapt to the changes that they experience. Also important to our use of climate-related mobility is that it covers many forms of moves. So climate mobility can encompass a temporary move to a nearby region by one family member, but it can be short-term or it can be long-term, or it can constitute labor migration for parts of the year by that one family member. Other types of migration could be a permanent relocation of a complete household, whether voluntary or forced. But even forced immobility could be an effect of climate change that also needs to be considered. So Neil will explain a little bit more about what we mean by considering a governance context in relation to climate mobility.
So if we could take the next slide, please. Okay, governance in the program refers to much more than government. We're seeking to investigate the range of political authorities through which what we call collective goals are pursued through policies, programs, service provision, infrastructure, et cetera, and not least in areas in which climate change impacts. So governance includes organizations and networks that go well beyond formal government institutions. We're also aware that local government institutions, as an important element in our field studies of specific localities, are themselves embedded in webs of institutional, economic, and political relations that shape actions and impose constraints on implementation of policies. So we talk about governance as being translocal, for instance, engaging with traditional authorities, with local government, with administrative sector departments, etc., and also transnational, so that it's being impacted upon by global government, national governments, by diasporas who are feeding into local households or communities. So to better understand the role of governance, we've taken 2 locations in each country in order to conduct a comparative analysis of governance as practiced in contexts which are experiencing quite different effects of slow onset climate change. And we're seeking to see if there are differences in the types of mobility and immobility being practiced. Through qualitative and quantitative fieldwork, we hope to gain an understanding of the role and effects of different governance contexts. So in Ghana, we're taking a locality in the north and a locality in the southern part of Ghana. And in Ethiopia, we're taking an area which is in the highlands and another area which is on the edge of the Rift Valley, so quite different agroclimatic locations. Although we haven't begun the detailed fieldwork yet, there are scoping studies and field visits that have taken place, and already we can see the practice of governance at the local level varies considerably between Ethiopia and Ghana. So we were correct to select these two countries at that level anyway. And obviously it reflects their respective histories, the types of states that they have, the political systems present, the ways that key assets and resources are controlled and managed, not least land, for instance, the agrarian conditions, the patterns of economic growth present and being pursued. In terms of policy, because research at DSA is meant to be pure research, but with policy relevance. In terms of policy, it is important that we investigate the ways that different political authorities engage with their populations. So that's obviously about things like the levels of service provision, the coherence of policies pursued, the degree of inclusiveness, the management of vulnerabilities, food security, insecurity, and much more. But it's also about how political authorities receive their authorization, which we're looking at, about accountability, and so on. Now, we've documented that climate change is present and acknowledged in both countries. National policies on climate change exist. Programs have been formulated, being funded, and being implemented, explained. We have also documented that individuals and their households have long practiced mobility, seasonal, regional, and not least more recently as a part of rapid urbanization. Now, do political authorities facilitate these? Do they mitigate the climate change effects in some ways? Do they see mobility as a means of adaptation? And is it as a means of adaptation? Is it purely at the individual level, or is there some collective element to it? Is it being desired, or is it being forced upon certain categories, etc.? Now, local governments can be seen to be the most obvious interface between individuals and their organizations, the households, associations, on the one side, and national government and global governance as well on the other side. In addressing climate change and the possible use of mobility as climate change adaptation, we see the field sites, two in each country, as I mentioned, as highly situated socio-ecological places or spaces. And we're seeking to understand how the dynamics of governance, climate change, and mobility interact and interrelate. And this, I have to assure you, is not easy, which goes right back to our first statement that we're trying to move away from simply saying climate change leads to mobility. Historically, it's an unfortunate assumption. In practice, it's an unfortunate assumption. Analytically, it's an unfortunate assumption. And in terms of understanding how it can be used as a positive element, migration as a positive element, it's also unfortunate that it's reduced to that causal relationship. So from a research perspective and from a policy perspective, we do find these tensions, these conflicts, these paradigms of thinking that we're trying to break down a little bit. But we also believe that there are new insights to be gained and very clear policy opportunities yet to be realized. Power is a key factor, clearly in the sense of who takes decisions, who implements, who is affected, in what ways. And not least, it's also about the types of agency present in all this. And on that, I'll hand back to Marie.
So so there are different degrees to which individuals and households have agency in taking steps that might partly be a response to climate change. And we've already touched a bit on this, in that there are various forms of mobility practices that individuals, households, and institutions can choose or be forced to opt for. But mobility and immobility here can be both voluntary and enforced. I'll try to exemplify this a little bit. So for instance, in Ghana, international migration or regional labor migration of one family member is an investment in an insecure future for the household or extended family, and an investment that also carries expectations of financial returns. But despite the anticipated access to a better life that is often associated with international migration, it's not an adaptation option for everyone. Even regional migration may not be an option for everyone. So on this other end of the scale with forced immobility, this can be seen in Ethiopia and Shashamane, one of our case areas. And here, small-scale farmers struggle with water scarcity and growing unpredictability in weather events for their farming practices. And additionally, their land is not even their own private holdings, but they consist of shares in state-owned land that each household has been allocated. And over time, population growth and decreasing soil quality have impacted on the land's productivity. So in Shashamane, a few of the younger community members have ventured into labor migration as a way to adapt to this situation. But others do not have the financial means or the education level to consider moving to the nearby town to seek employment. And such employment could be in Hawassa, in the nearby larger town, at an Hawassa Industrial Park. And Neil will say more about this example in the end of this presentation. So instead, these forcibly immobile Shashamane farmers must rely on occasional support from family members, as well as the government's programs of improved seeds and fertilizers, although these have limited effects. In this way, the opportunities for the individual households to adapt to climate-related changes is very much formed by factors such as access to government services, education levels, and indeed to networks. Equally relevant for the agency of adaptation are the perceptions of individuals with regards to their strategies and opportunities in socio-political and economic contexts that they find themselves in. And in this relation, the activities of political authorities are equally relevant. So agency comes from several sources, and that is one important set of factors that we are trying to explore in the research program. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just to say a little bit more about why we have chosen Ghana and Ethiopia. And first, let me say something about Ghana. I mean, I believe Joseph already started to talk a little bit about migration in relation to the Ghanaian context. So let me unfold this a little bit more here in relation to this presentation. So historically, Ghana has been subject to various agendas and systems of governance, from systematic extraction of slaves from Arabic slave traders and transatlantic slave trade that goes back to the 16th century, and then up to its leading role in driving a Pan-African political agenda under Kwame Nkrumah, and then up to the continuous strong role in ECOWAS that is there today. And the varied history of authority and division of power has also co-created this decentralized system of governance that exists today, so with influential local and traditional authorities. And the continuous presence and prominence of traditional leadership in Ghana carries importance for how concepts of sovereignty, authority, and legitimacy have developed and shaped households, practices, and the relationships between citizens and governing institutions. And the changing governance context also carries links to diverse forms of mobility. So Ghana has a long history of internal, regional, and international movements. Yet mobility patterns such as the forced extraction of people from especially the north that was established through colonial policies, well, those dynamics continue to carry importance today. Remnants can be seen in the persistent disparity between the northern and southern regions, The North continues to be less resourceful as government institutions have not offered adequate economic infrastructure and practical solutions to support equal North and South development. And this in turn carries implications for people's opportunities to form adaptation strategies. This is significant when we know that the rural poor are the most vulnerable to climate change, and that 42% of the population in Ghana rely on agricultural activities. So further complicating disparity is also the difference in agroecological zones, where the northern regions are more savanna-like than the forested south. So there are fewer alternatives to farming-dependent livelihoods in the north. So this south-north divide, as Neil also said, is also reflected in the program design that we have put together, in that we have a case study area in Upper East region in the north and another case study area in Eastern region in the southern part of Ghana. So the interlinkages between governance, mobility, and environmental challenges can be exemplified through historical regional inequality that has been a driver for forms of mobility such as urbanization and international migration as ways to adapt to change. And other linkages can be seen in industrial investment projects, such as with forced relocations and environmental changes that was generated with the construction of the Akosombo hydroelectric dam in southeastern Ghana. I don't have time to go into this example, but let me go over to Neil to say something about Ethiopia as another case study area.
Next slide, please. Yeah, I appreciate time is running, so I'll be quite brief. Ethiopia has been described as Africa's best example of a developmental state, taking an ideas theoretical argument which came out 20 years ago, but it's now being reassessed and reapplied in viewing the nature of Ethiopia. And that certainly runs a little bit counter to how the government would like to present itself. It was a highly dubious election in 2005, where it still described itself as being highly democratic, etc. New elections were planned for this autumn, but they've been postponed due to COVID-19. But what we can see is it's a highly centralized system of governance, the continuation of a somewhat inefficient civil service. There are serious tensions between center and regions, not least because of the ethnic-based constitution, federal constitution. So you have federal regions based primarily on ethnicity. Local government is a vehicle for party politics with strong party clientelism, continuing something which emerged during the rule of Mengistu, the Derg. Access to land and land use continues to be a highly critical area, important not least due to the agrarian nature of the economy and the continuing high challenge and major challenge of food insecurity. But there's also the importance, as I've mentioned, of ethnic identities. And this is very relevant when it comes to mobility, tensions. As soon as tensions emerge, then ethnicity of migrants is raised. And we've also seen the weaponization of mobility under both Haile Selassie and Mengistu, when populations were being forcibly relocated to undermine some of the groups who were contesting their rule. Most recently, international migration has also emerged as an important aspect of mobility with Ethiopia, particularly to the Gulf states and to South Africa, actually. As I mentioned, the establishment of ethnic-based federalist regional governments has resolved some conflicts temporarily, but it's facilitated and intensified others, not least around land use, around access to and benefits from service provision, education, etc. Similarly, with respect to economic growth, who is gaining the benefit, which ethnic groups, etc. Here we see good examples of central government, which is leading programs to bring in foreign investments into key sectors in agriculture, flowers, basmati rice, sugarcane, etc., very often based upon foreign investors who come in, are given access to state land, and this involves movement of people off the land, etc. It's also beginning to emerge in other industries, ready-made garments, for instance, telecom, etc. As said, economic growth has been rapid, but from a very low base. Urbanization and international migration have increased quite rapidly. Political leadership centralized, strong, but also fragmented along the ethnic issues, as I've mentioned already. The recent reforms under Abiy Ahmed are very fragile. They've been praised, raised and praised, but they are fragile. And coherence in responses to climate change may be there in national policy, but they do not appear to come through in subnational implementation approaches. So climate change is a very real challenge in Ethiopia. Coping is present, but it's reactive rather than proactive and not coordinated, as I'll illustrate in one moment. As part of this picture, mobility is a clear strategy for many households and individuals in the localities where the fieldwork will be undertaken. That's in Wallo, as I said, in the highlands, in central northern Ethiopia, and Shashamane, which is southwest of Addis on the slopes of the Rift Valley. But this migration or mobility, these climate-induced mobility practices, it's difficult to know, is it by choice, is it by desire, is it by necessity? And that is where our detailed field work, which was due to start shortly after the summer, but may be delayed due to COVID-19, that is what we hope to investigate. We tentatively argue that local government, perhaps more than local governance institutions generally, has not played a role in facilitating climate change adaptation and forms of mobility in Ethiopia. And this leaves agency in climate change adaptation very much with individuals and households to negotiate and formulate practices. And that's a missed opportunity, a major missed opportunity. Could I have the next slide, please? Just a very brief example. In Shashamane, which is also quite an attractive, there's a very big lake there where a famous marathon runner has established a large resort, but it's in Hawassa. They've created an industrial park. Now, this is interesting because it is currently employing 32,000, mainly young women, plans to have 60,000 within 3 years. At the moment, 15 businesses are located there, all making ready-made garments. 14 are international and 1 is Ethiopian. Now, what's interesting, we know that climate change is an issue here. In the villages that we have visited, as Marie mentioned, there are problems with water, accessing water, irrigation. The seeds that they obtain are no longer the seeds that meet the needs of the climate. The raising in temperatures, et cetera, yields are going down. And the potential for employment here is very interesting from a household perspective. But there are 10 recruiting centers. You have to register in a recruiting center. You have to have education up to class 9, and then you become eligible for being employed in the industrial park. There are no trade unions. Everything is regulated by the central federal government. The pay is $1 a day, but in terms of being an alternative to perhaps sending your daughter to Saudi Arabia, to South Africa, it is quite an interesting possibility. But the coordination between local government, education, to access this type of employment, and central government in the way that they regulate and set up this plant, there is no coordination. And it's just a little example of the type of missed opportunity in terms of design, in terms of implementation, and not least in terms of the sustainability of what is taking place here. And this is just one example of the types of missed opportunities that we hope to arrive at the end as part of our policy conclusions. And at that point, I will say thank you and stop.
Okay, thank you so much, Marie and Neil, for your exhaustive and exciting presentation. I've enjoyed it so much. I could listen to you for the rest of the day, I believe, given the critical nature of the issues that your research seeks to address. So I'll turn it to the audience so as to be able to take some questions. So I see hands up. So I'll call Faith up, and then Manasseh will follow. So Faith, please, I'll bring you up on the podium. Faith. Sometimes it takes a few seconds for this to pop up on this podium. Yes, so here we are. So please proceed. Thank you.
A great presentation. I really enjoyed it. So I have my question is more in line with, the role of local government. And this is obviously from experience of practice, because I know in SADC, local government plays a huge role in terms of like mitigating, the effects of climate change. So what have been the challenges? Like, what are the challenges that limit local government from, leading, the process of just coming up with, strategies to assist communities, just in terms of mitigating? Is it an issue of funding? Do they have to wait for, the main government administration? Just what have been the challenges in that regard? I think that's.
Shall I take that? Thanks, Faith. Very good question, and I'm pretty happy to hear you.
That's it. Did you get my question?
Yes, I did. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, please go ahead. I can hear you. There's been a bit of a break in her internet transmission.
Yeah. I mean, the role of local government, and here we have to be very careful about how we define local government, because it may be operating within the local space, but it's very much being defined by its relationship to national government and also international government. So that's how we see local government. But just very briefly, yes, it's about responsibilities which are allocated. It's about resources which are provided to generate those, to deliver on those responsibilities. But it's also about the downward relationship. It's also about the relationship between local government and the citizens, shall we say, the communities, but I would use the word citizens because they're being constituted by their relationship with local government. Are they being involved in terms of identifying the problems, in terms of addressing the problems, in terms of monitoring the work of local government, seeking to address those problems, and not least in terms of bringing the coherence in local government, which you often do not see in national government, so that you'll see separate sector, should we say, ministries, all taking up some aspect of slow onset climate change, the effects, but they do not coordinate. And local government is expected to coordinate. It's expected to take up the agricultural side, the educational side, the delivery of water side, the infrastructure side, the management of flooding, culverts, et cetera, And in that sense, local government is placed in a very difficult position very often. But that's what we're seeking to investigate, the role of local government very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks very much, Faith, for your brilliant question. I'll move to Manasseh. It takes a few seconds to bring up yet.
You're there, Manasseh.
All right, Manasseh, please, you have the floor.
Hello, Neil and Marie. Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I just had one thought of a part of the work that we did a year ago from the picture of the child that is on your presentation. Are there any dynamics of undocumented child migrants, children actually deciding to migrate on their own? And what are the implications in terms of your question around climate mobility on those issues? Is there anything like that within the context of Ghana and Ethiopia?
Marie, do you want to start? Maybe Ghana?
Well, I think the picture is from the one from Ethiopia, right? Maybe you are better placed to answer that one.
Okay, I took the picture. It's a child who has not migrated, but if I remember correctly, is gathering firewood, which probably is a very traditional gender typical role, not just particular to Ethiopia. Child migration, that is something we have to investigate. I cannot say at the moment. There is no secondary data that we have found which actually goes into the detail, at least in Ethiopia, and I'm working mainly on Ethiopia, which actually tells us very much about the categories of different types of migration or mobility and who is doing it. I mean, there is some discussion about youth. Obviously, there is some discussion about young women, not least in international migration, which tends to get a lot more attention perhaps, and that's not least because it's seen as a issue from a European perspective. But again, I mean, that's also interesting because mobility or migration is often, from a policy perspective, seen as a negative factor. And we can actually see historically, it's always been there in different forms and different practices, and is therefore very much to be seen as a potentially a positive element. Obviously, child migration, I would personally not expect to see that as a positive element, because it would usually reflect a breakdown in the household and also a breakdown in local government or other political authority responsibility to a particular vulnerable group. I don't know if you have any comment from the Ghanaian perspective, Marie.
I think actually Joseph's presentation this morning, he's probably much better positioned to speak to the migration of youth in Ghana. So I don't know, Joseph, maybe you have actually some input there.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes, I have observed the mobility of children. I have interviewed individuals who at the time of the interview were technically within the category of the child age group in that respect. So yes, there are occasions where you have young children who move. So autonomous migration among children is present, unfortunately. And they tend to occur in different forms. Sometimes children will migrate under the guise of fostering, where they are independently moving, but then they are heading towards maybe a foster family who will work with them, just as you mentioned, restaurants and other forms of domestic assistantship, maybe in exchange for letting the child, I'm using the word letting the child go to school, as opposed to maybe the child being an illiterate child, because the government does not permit that. So sometimes parents will say, okay, my child is going to stay with the auntie, but that auntie or uncle is not necessarily a biological relative, it's a form of fostering. We also have the occasions where young people actually move on their own outside the foster family kinship system. And as a result, these individuals will end up technically becoming sometimes street children in the destinations where they end up. They tend to move on the trajectory of maybe I'm going to be resident with a family member or a relative who has already migrated. And that relative might not be officially maybe a person with a family or a young adult, or that matter. It could be another previously migrated person from that locale that the individual child comes from. So those dynamics unfortunately exist, and they pose subsequent social welfare challenges due to issues relating to trauma, vulnerability, exploitation, etc. So I will put it in that context in response to your question. And again, we can discuss in the afternoon, if we have time, how the implications of these issues, because restauranting, as you were pointing out, the informal sector work becomes very attractive to such young individuals because they need to survive, they need to find somewhere they can stay, and then they need to be able to feed themselves or find food. And those becomes unfortunate, difficult experiences when the child is eventually in the urban destination. So, Bob, thank you for letting me in on this, but it's an issue of passion and concern of mine as well. Likewise, Neil and Marie, with regards to your research. So thanks very much for that.
Can I just add to that? Because it's fascinating what you say, Joseph, because many years ago, Mamdani wrote the book, The Myth of Population Control. He presents very clearly that a child becomes an economic asset from around about the age of 4. So the idea of birth control is an anathema, particularly to very poor households, because they see this potential. And as you say, from within the household or from outside the household, and particularly in the informal sector, in mechanical workshops and this type of areas, children are a very important source of labor.
Yeah, I agree in that respect. And it's consistent across at least Africa, if I should put it that way, and evidence in Asia,
Exactly.
likewise, countries in the Latin American region. So it's a global phenomenon within the of the developing regions of the world. And it's quite sad to see the dynamics play out, especially when they emerge in the migration pattern in that respect, because the levels of vulnerability and exploitation becomes extremely high. So these are aspects, again, as Neil mentioned earlier, and then Marie, you also alluded to that, which will have some implications for policy within the wider migration governance systems. Because when these young ones end up in the various destinations, they are also often seen as a menace to society, or sometimes criminalized or victimized. They become a victim of their own initiative, or sometimes effort or desperate circumstance, as it were, in the first place, and that creates a further ongoing social welfare and social policy concerns. But I will pause there because of the time. And thank you, Manasseh, for your great question. I believe for the rest of us in this panel, there were about 10 people in the audience, collectively, and then it went down to 9 and then 7. So I believe members are moving to other groups to maybe listen to other presentations. So I'd like to thank everyone who, of course, presented this morning for your excellent presentations and then exciting insights. I like the dynamics in terms of the variation of the issues, but related to the same substance with regards to migration and experience of migrants. We have our second session this afternoon at 4 p.m. British time, and I would really encourage each of us to come if your time will permit, so that we can further the discussion, listen to our next set of presentations, and then maybe expand the conversations as well around these issues of concern, as we've all been able to highlight. So I'd like to wrap it up by saying a big thank you to everyone. Neil asked a question earlier regarding my work. And Neil, if it's okay, we can talk about it this afternoon so we don't keep everybody the line. Yeah, but how I define migration is a very simple answer, but I think it's useful to add it to the afternoon pots to keep the suspense and excitement going. So let's take a break, enjoy the rest of the next few hours, and then we'll resume our session at 4 p.m. British Standard Time. So please check your local times so that we are all in concert. So thank you all very much, and I'll see you soon. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. It was good. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Be patient when there are technical issues, please, because we seem to be running into different rooms, and getting out of the rooms can be a bit of a challenge. So I believe it will be smoother this afternoon. So thank you for your patience earlier this morning.
All right. Thank you.
And comments. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Rajishakir Olarotime. I'm from Nigeria. I'm particularly Sociology Department, Faculty of Social Sciences, Lagos State University in Nigeria. And the title of my paper is Artificiality of Colonial Boundary Creation, Sociocultural Care-Seeking Practices in African Border Community. The next slide, please. Yes. Africa, from time immemorial, we've been experiencing, we have borders, we have boundaries. And the argument is not about if the colonial masters were the one that brought about the issue of boundary and land borders in Africa. Communities have been divided. Each community knows its boundary, knows its land boundary. But when we, the scramble for Africa started in Berlin during the Berlin Conference in 1884 to 1885. This brought about the idea of dividing lands in Africa. And the pathetic situation about this is the fact that lands were divided, allocated without the notice of the Africans, without the notice of residents in communities. So when we are talking about scramble for Africa, the residents were not considered. In fact, the allocation of lands were done outside Africa, were done outside this continent. And the European colonizers, they have little or no knowledge about Africa, about their lands, about their boundaries, and specifically their communities. And if we want to generalize that, they have little or no idea about their culture. So they partitioned African land from European capitals. Populations of the same group of people were divided, and they were made to understand that they belong to different countries without considering their interests. The next slide, please. The introduction still continues. The colonial power utilized various techniques just to ensure that they get resource-rich land.
It looks like we're having some connectivity issues with Raj. Raj, are you there? Are you? Okay, please proceed.
Okay. So like I said, that they use all forms of, mechanism just to ensure that the lands were divided, borders were created only in the interest of the colonial masters. And like I said, that they made use of deceit, fraud, intimidation. And I mentioned the case of Benin Kingdom or your kingdom, where the leaders resisted the forces of the colonial master. But at the end of the day, they use intimidation and forces to make sure that they get rid of these leaders. European powers preferentially dealt with African local leaders and chieftaincies. They ensure that they impose the land demarcation on them. The next slide, please. Part of this demarcation process, the Prime Minister of the British Prime Minister in 1906 demonstrated this arbitrary and under-informed approach at the signing of Anglo-French Convention between Nigeria and the Niger Republic in that very year. And he stated, and I quote, "We, the British and French, have been engaged in drawing lines upon maps where no white man's foot ever stepped. We have been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew exactly where the mountains and rivers exist." And this quotation explains to us the imposition of this demarcation and the fact that the demarcation and the scramble for African land were done outside African continent. The next slide, please. The statement of the problem. This will go in line with the objective of the study. We said partitioning of African territory land put some communities if not all, are the receiving end of negative and disadvantages. And why we said this is because the artificial boundary between Nigeria and other countries stretches over thousands of kilometers, affecting each of these communities in different ways. Study conducted on border or economic has not what in fact we are not this must have happened centuries or even decades ago. But what we are saying is there is research need for us to go back to look at what is the genesis of whatever conflict that is taking place in our yes. We use, for the theoretical framework, we use socio-ecological model. And socio-ecological model explain how the environment, the physical environment, influence the way people behave. In the case of the border communities available around their community. The next slide. I have a lot of slides. That's why I'm making it short. The methodology. This study is cross-cultural, cross-sectional, and exploratory in nature. We adopted purposive method by selecting 3 states from the Southwest geopolitical zone. And in each of these 3 states, we selected 1 border from each community. Like in Lagos State, we have 2 borders. In Ogun State, we have 2. In Oyo State, we have 1 official border. So we use simple random sampling through balloting to select 1 border community in each of those states. The qualitative method adopted include key informant interviews and focus group discussion. The next slide. We also administer 1,200 questionnaire. The results. The people are relatively poor because of their location, because they are being restricted. Their movement are being restricted. Trader, but a deep insight to being a trader at the border discovered that majority of those that claim to be traders get involved in illegal business. They are the ones that were assisting the so-called main traders to transport their goods from the other side of the border to where they want to the destination of such goods across the border, so that the owner of such goods will be able to take it from there. Then majority of them are not educated. We experienced this in 2 of those communities selected, particularly in Okerete border community. When we got there, we discovered that the only school that was available in this community was closed. So any child in this community that wants to go to school must travel across the border, go to Republic of Benin in order for them to get whatever type of education. Next slide, please. Then, due to this demarcation, no government are ready to put the best of their resources at the border, with the mindset that if I should put any resources at the border, people can easily tap it from the other side of the border. It is a known fact that most African borders are porous, and this explains why governments, even from the both sides, are not ready to put the best of their resources at the border, which affected the border communities. There is a lot of discriminatory infrastructural neglect just because of some of these facts, which originated from the way the borders were demarcated. In Nigeria, for example, land claims were not allocated to where the colonial masters do not have resources, where they don't have cocoa. Then why, even up to today, the government that are coming in place after independence also live in line with this same mentality that, okay, let us maintain where we only get resources. The border communities lack social amenities, including water, electricity, telecommunication. In fact, in the 3 border communities visited, 2 of them do not have telecommunication system at all. You can't make call, you can't receive call. Immediately you are getting close to the community, your network will disappear. And this explains how pathetic their situation is. They lack health facilities. In fact, the issue of this health facility is pathetic. It's pathetic because government in the side of Nigeria constructed a building in each of these communities visited. But we discovered that by the time we get there, you see some of those pictures. You discover that those structures are empty. Nothing is taking place in there. The next slide, please. So if we look at the ratio of the population of each of these communities, in Seme border community, Ilara border community, and Okerete border community, it explains in terms of healthcare facilities what these border community residents are really passing through. And this includes the migrants too, those that are traveling. You know, I said the other time that it is a known fact that border communities in Africa are porous, and this encourages all sorts of, different types of migration. So when you look at even those ones that are indigenous of this border community, with the number of the acclaimed doctors, you discover that they are lacking behind seriously. Compare that with the WHO standard of medical doctors to the residents. Next slide. Next slide.
You have 2 minutes, please.
The next slide, please. Yes, this is, some of the structures referred to as the hospital, the primary healthcare centers in those communities, and they are empty without nothing. Next slide, please. Yes, this explains the issue of, discrimination. This particular picture now explains where the tying of that road stop. The tied one is Republic of Benin, while the untied one is Nigeria. And, is a kind of always, this location is a boundary location. Hello?
Yes.
Yeah. This picture is a boundary location that divided buildings. That divided buildings. This a building into 2, claiming one to be in Republic of Benin, while the other one to be in Nigeria. In fact, majority of these border community residents do not see themselves as belonging to one side of the border. They have that impression that, how will you stop me from moving to my cousin's place, my brother's place? And this encourages illegal movement of goods. Since they know that the border, immigrations and police at the border cannot stop them. The moment they speak their language from way, they won't be able to stop them. So regardless of whatever load they are carrying, they will just allow them to cross the border. The next slide. This vehicle moved to Okerete, one of those border communities, just once in a day. The moment you miss it, that means you are going to wait till the following day. The next slide. Medical-wise, most of them use traditional healthcare facilities because that is what is available to them. It's not as if they don't want to use the Western healthcare facility, but because they don't have option, then they have identity crisis. Like I said the other time, for them to explain Fulani men, like those group of people, they are nomadic cattle rearers that move from one place to another. It was as a result of this artificial boundary creation that brought about the issue of attack here and there. Before the creation of borders, these people were moving around and they were accepted. But because the creation of border communities created that consciousness that, yes, this place belongs to these people and you cannot unnecessarily, intrude into my land, led to the issue of herdsmen attack here and there in most parts of Africa. Next slide, if that time will still permit me.
Raj, your time is up, so can you please conclude?
Okay, the conclusion is, that, like I said, the conclusion is that most border creation in Africa, if not all, were created on the basis, without considering the interest of the resident. And this resulted to porosity of our border that encourage illegal cross-border activities. It encourages all form of, illegal migrants that even reside in these border communities for a while before getting a chance to cross the border. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for your wonderful and very interesting presentation. I'm sorry I had to cut you because of time. I appreciate the fact that you have such a volume in terms of material to present to us. But we'll take some questions, and then hopefully we only skipped a couple of slides, so that's fine. You did well within your abilities to cover so much ground. So I'll turn to the audience and the panelists in our session to please raise your hand if you have a question for our presenter, please. Whilst waiting for hands to be raised, I would like to post a question. If I don't see any hand yet, so I will put in whilst we allow members to formulate their questions or put their thoughts together. So I was wondering, with regards to these border towns and their citizens or residents, what currency, in your experience, do they necessarily trade in the context of the steady size that you use? Do they trade in the Nigerian currency or they trade in the other countries' currency? And how does that work out in the context of the normal daily transactional activities? If you can respond to that, please.
Yes. What is obtainable at the border community is that if you've ever visited any border community in Africa, at the point of entry, there is always a kind of market where money are being exchanged. As in, you have to change the currency, like in Seme, for example. Seme is a border community in Nigeria. That same community is divided into two. So we have part of it in Republic of Benin, part of it in Nigeria. So for you to cross to the Seme side of Republic of Benin, you are holding Naira as a Nigerian. You have to change your Naira to Seva at the point of entry. You don't even need to do that before you get there. When you get to the border, you see people displaying money that you should come. They have the rate they give you. If you are pleased with it, you change the money so that immediately you trek across, you start spending the other money. But most of the time, that does not affect or change the consciousness of the indigenes. In that, even when they change money, that does not affect their sense of belonging, that I'm going there to visit my cousin. And that is why at times, we do they do have issues with all these security agents at the borders, because the moment they want to stop them, it becomes another thing. That can you go and do the same thing in your own village? Can they stop you from seeing your cousin, your brother, or even your father just within, a very little distance?
Wow, that's interesting. I still don't see any hand here, so we'll thank you very much and then move to the next presenter. And I'm sure should any questions, discussions come up in the latter part of the session, we'll bring some of these issues up, because I still have at least one more question I would have liked to pose. So thank you so much, and talk to you later in the course of the session.
Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everybody, depending from where you are getting us from. Thank you so much for joining us for this DSA virtual conference and taking the time to be with us. I'm Dirango Ngonjiri from University of Nairobi, Kenya. I hope at this time of COVID-19, the challenging time, you're keeping safe and you're protecting yourself with your families. Despite the challenges we have, many people have lost their jobs. Many people have gone without some meals, and that's why this afternoon I'm bringing a paper on the economics of prostitution in Kenya, my country. Next slide. Next slide, please. Introduction part of it. Prostitution is one of the oldest professions that has been never known, but it has all the traditional markets, it has the pricing, the demand and supply, but it has never been understood, and no much research has done on it, and that's why we are doing on this. It has been in Kenya. It has been practicing our independence in this country, and people have been practicing now and then, but it is not rigorous yet in Kenya. But you find it plays a role in economic growth of this country. Getting data for this is very easy, because we have from commercial sex organization, we are able to get all the data and from them. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. We in Kenya have various kind of prostitutions. One, we have the street prostitution. By street prostitution, whereby you find either men or we already study on the streets. And then we have the room rental. By room rental prostitution, this whereby you find, for example, ladies rent a room. After renting the room, they bring men in that room now and then, and they charge as per the room. Then we have the homes kind of prostitution. In home kind of prostitution, this whereby we have the ladies or men bring their client in their homes, such a way that they're able to share the bills. Also, we have the digital prostitution. With the rise of social media, right now you're seeing that most of the prostitution, they are going in digital format, in the WhatsApp, in the Facebook, in the Twitter. They're able to get their clients on the social medias and digitally. And also we have tourism prostitution. For example, in Kenya, you have the coastal town Mombasa, whereby we have many tourists coming visiting us every year, and we have many men, many girls going there for prostitution. And also, we have the international prostitution in this country. The international prostitution, you find that we have girls from all over the Africa, other globally, coming to Kenya for the prostitution. Also, the same case happens with Kenyans going to other countries for the kind of trade in the other countries. Also, you have sponsors. By sponsors and bentens. Sponsors is this whereby old men take young girls, more so age mates of their daughters, and also bentens whereby you find old men take old women take young boys age mate of their sons, and that's kind of a prostitution also. Then we have the big hotels. I think if in Kenya, if you visit most of the hotels, especially in the lunch break, you find the car park is almost full. But when you go to the main hotel, you find nobody is in the hotel. Why? You find all these people, they were coming from the offices, and they get a room, and they take their service there, but now they are not there for the lunch. Next slide, please. in this picture, you can see the kind of prostitution we have in this country. In the first picture, there was a case case in court in Nairobi, Milimani Court, whereby prostitution prostitutes in this country, they wanted to be recognized as organization and be legalized as organization. But under the constitution of this country, it is illegal business, so it was rejected in the court of law. And also, when you go to the second picture, those are there are two men, also they are in the prostitution business. When you go to the third picture, you see these are young ladies. These are what we call the street prostitution, whereby they wait for their clients on the streets. Waiting their clients on the streets is whereby when a man passes on the street, they call that man and they discuss about the pricing and all that thing. Then you have the third one. Now you see there's a big difference between the third and the fourth one. Why? You see the fourth one is in a big estate, in a poach estate, whereas the third one is in a rural town, whereby they don't have good facilities. But when you go to the fourth one, they have good facilities, and then there comes the charging. So you find that when you're in downtown, the price is cheaper than the uptown. Also, you find the crowd, they are different from the downtown to uptown. The crowds are different, completely different. Next slide, please. Why did we study this? What is the purpose of this study? One, we wanted to understand what is the role of prostitution in the economy. Yes, does prostitution play any role in this economy? Does it make the economy grow? Does it make the economy move in any? Does it play any role in GDP? The other factor, wanted to know how are the axis of how prostitution markets are organized. To know how are they organized in a manner whereby it's like the normal market, the capital market, they are organized such a way that there's demand and supply. And we shall, in our findings, shall come to have to see that. And that's what the other thing we wanted to, the purpose of the study is the technology shape the demand and supply. We wanted to see that with the coming of technology, does it shape the demand and supply of the services? And that's the other thing. We wanted to see law enforcement and how to regulate the prostitution. Should we have law enforcement than regularize? Because when we have in Kenya, we do law enforcement. So should we regularize or should we have law enforcement happen in the sector? Next slide, please. The objective of study. One of the objectives is managing prostitution as the 21st reality. Yes, you have to accept it's a reality in the 21st century. So how are we going to manage this in a reality way? The other, determine the sex worker pricing. How do they make their pricing? How do they make the bargaining? How do they need to be taxed? Can they pay taxes out of their trade? And also, the last one, determine the role of prostitution to the economy growth. Next slide, please. What are the research gaps? One, to how to organize the trade. This we don't know how can we organize the trade in the modality can be used to organize the trade in the country. And the other thing, prostitution for economic growth. What can we do for prostitution to be having economic growth? And the other thing, pandemic impacts on the prostitution. Currently, we have COVID-19 happening globally, and what is the impact of COVID-19 on prostitution? By this, you find that the people in this trade, they are not able to do their practices, and there are some factors that are making them not to be in the trade. Next slide, please. What is the relevance of study? One, we wanted to shed light on the underground markets and the labor economics and the risk behavior and the marriage and the gender, because you find they say prostitution is for ladies, but you find even if prostitution is happening, there must be a man and a woman, so that's for it to happen. And also you find this as an underground market, and what role does it have to the economy? This underground market is play a big role in developing of the economy. And the other thing, what's the role in labor economics? Does it help in the growth of labor in a country? And also the risk behavior in this kind of business of industry. The other relevance of study is the sex industry exists in every country. Yes, sex industry exists globally in every country you go. It exists, and it has a substantial part in the underground economy of every country. And the other relevance, the tax income. How can we as a country make tax out of this for the economic growth? Next slide, please. And the other factor, prostitution is an export. Earlier we learned that we have international prostitution. So out of this, can we export this kind of prostitution? Can we export to other country for it to be an international income earner for a country? And also, the other factor, how can we recognize what process, how modality can we use to recognize prostitution in Kenya? Next slide, please. Methodology. The methodology we used, we started five areas in Kenya. One, Nairobi. Nairobi is the capital city of Kenya. Nakuru is an urban city in Kenya. Mombasa is a coastal town and city in Kenya. Namanga and Maraba, those are border towns. One bordering Tanzania, the other bordering Uganda. And out of this, the population, they are mobile, they are not fixed. You find that they are migrants from other areas, they go these places, so they are not born there. And also the population, they are ethnic mixed, they come from different ethnic background, and all of them, one factor, they are economically deprived. They come from poor background, all of them. Those are one of the factors. How did we process? The interviewers were recruited among the women sex workers themselves, such a way that among the sex workers, they are grouped in a way such a way there's a leader. So the leader we used to recruit the other women to join on how to interview them. And then the interviewers helped to draft the questionnaire and how to do the questionnaire and the question to be asked for the research. Next slide, please. Interviewers also advise the question and the appropriate response from the categories that we selected. And also, the interviewers were able to translate the question to different languages. You find the process, they come from different background. So some of them, they don't understand the national language, which is English, or the Swahili, which is also a national language. So there are those mother tongues. So the interviewers were able to translate the questionnaire to the mother tongue so that you can be able to understand and get feedback. We did a survey. The participants were 120 participants in this survey, and they were aged between 15 to around the age of 50 years. Next slide, please. Now, this one you see is a Maraba border point in bordering Kenya, bordering Uganda. If it is oil tankers, so you find these drivers and the other drivers, they come to the prostitute business such a way that the prostitute come to this so that they can be able to get income from the border from the lorry drivers. Next slide, please. Our findings. The finding, which was backed by statistical data from the survey we did for the National Registry, the research and the report, 9 cases decided not to participate in our research, and the 2 cases were minor. By minor, they were below 15 years, and which, for your information, they were 11 years and 13 years. There was a small social network of sexual workers in Namanga. This is not a big town, so they are small in number. And on the 40 workers in the brothers, 15 works digitally, so that they work through the internet. 10 works by Rona, they work alone, they don't depend on anybody. 20 workers work in exclusively tourist crimes. So for them, they are designated for tourist crimes only. Next slide, please. An estimated 15.9% of the women nationally access sex for money, gifts, or favor from men in one way or the other. There were unwanted pregnancies. 90% confirmed they have done abortion from unwanted pregnancies. And also, the commercial sex workers, 65% of them worked in the bars, hotels, bus stages, discos, and 10% they're international business. 15% they work from home, and 10% they have what we say they are sponsors. And out of this research, we found that 57% of them, they have stable partners, such a way that the partner, they don't know if what the partner does, the business does. So he gets up in the morning, he goes to CBD, but he doesn't go to any office. That is going for the sex work, that is obviously goes, but the partner is not aware what he or she does. Next slide, please. The median age was 17 years, that's in urban center, and 22 years in the rural, which is rural is Namanga and Maraba. Service crimes is median, 15. So any person in urban area, 15 crimes per week, and also in the rural areas, which is Namanga and Maraba, there are six per week. The income from this in the urban areas, which is Nairobi, Mombasa, and Nakuru, $90 to $300 per week. And also in the rural area, which is Namanga and the Maraba, $14.7 and $50 per week. And also STI, so that's 30% of them have STI. So 80% they're heterosexuals and 20% they're homosexuals. Next slide, please. Non-payments, you find they exchange sex for money, 30% they are not paid. They have this high risk of physical attack. There's high risk of physical violence, 40% of them. Unwanted pregnancy, that's 90% abortions. Also, there's because of using multiple sex partners, cancer risk is very high. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Our recommendation: sex workers should create necessary work for them, vital to address. As the government should address sex workers in their country. We should have HIV and STI prevention policies. Government should promote poverty elevation policies, offering child support for grants. For example, you find most of these sex workers are dropped from primary schools, so the government should come with a policy in such a way that when girls drop out of schools, they go back to schools after giving birth. Next slide, please. For example, this you find that women from Narok County, they are given, after giving birth, they are given work to do, which is they are doing beadwork. And they do, after doing the beadwork, they sell the beads to tourists who are coming along. Next slide, and you see some of them, they have the children with them. Next slide, please. I have 1 minute left. We have to remove the workplace discrimination and harassment. The government should take opportunity to remove the segment of sex workers by providing alternative source of income for these sex workers. And also we talk about dropping out of school and help them. Next slide, please. Legalize the act. That's what we say, the research gap. Can we legalize? We also had a research gap. Can we tax? And also the culture barriers and reduce the stigma of sex workers. And also the sex workers themselves should have organized self-help group that can able to become income generation apart from sex work business. Next slide, please. And also embrace technology and start connecting the crime socially. And finally, further research should be done on this subject. Next slide, please. The challenges, rule provision, sex business is not under the constitution. The capacity building, they are not empowered. There also this culture, and also there is arrest and imprisonment for the sex workers. Next slide, please. And that's the end of my session. Asanteni sana, which is thank you so much. Question? Welcome. Thank you so much. Asanteni sana. Joseph, can you hear me?
Right, yes. Thank you very much for your presentation. I was getting myself onto the podium. So we would like to take some questions. So if you have a question, kindly raise your hand. I see one hand raised, so I will take Esther. I will take Esther's question in that regard, and then we'll take it from there. So I see Esther's hand is raised, but Esther, if it's a question for Indiragu, then I'll put you on the stage. So if it's not a question for Indiragu, then we can hold on until your session, but just wanted to clarify. So I couldn't see her question. So hello, Esther, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Yes, please. Please go ahead with your question.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. In all, I just want to ask the presenter, what do you think about prostitution? Should it be legalized? Did you find out that prostitution should be legalized? And what are the effects of legalizing prostitution on the economy of the study area? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esther. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Joseph. According to my research, we find that there's a research gap because my research was not so much on legalizing prostitution. So further research been done on how to legalize prostitution. But from my findings, prostitution should not be legalized in Kenya. Why? Because we don't have policies that are able to guide prostitution to be developed as a business in this country. So in Kenya, should not be legalized. But you find that it has some economical benefits in this country. Why? You find most of these prostitutes, especially the ladies, they take their children to school out of that business. They abuse their mothers, their father, their parents, their shelters at the villages out of this out of their business, their income, their business, and also they have their brothers and sisters, and they take them to school out of these businesses. So in one or the other, they are able to get income from it. And also you find most of these ladies and some men, they are able to generate other income, other businesses out of this, so they raise capital from this. And another factor, you find that even if they do this business, in one or the other, they take back the money back to the economy through taxation, but taxation because they spend the money in the economy. So the money come back to the economy. So in one or the other, it helps the economy. But you need a policy that you're able to guide it before it has been legalized in this country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esther, for your question. I'll bring our next questioner. Raj has a question, so I'll put him on this podium.
Thank you, Joseph. Hi, Raj.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. The question Esther asked, I was almost asking the same question, that are you advising that, or are you recommending that they should legalize it or not? But my question is this: I appreciate the presenter for trying, because the business of prostitution is an hidden one that is not really, for people to really respond is something that is difficult. Having said that, in the presentation, you show a particular picture where we have a lot of tanker trucks, and you said they are there to patronize the prostitutes. And I asked myself, one, are those patronizing these prostitutes only the tanker drivers? Are there not any other one? Then is it not possible?
Thank you, Raj, for the question. Well, the client, they are not only tanker drivers, but you find drivers, long distance drivers, they are the most client in this country because they don't have their families, they don't live with their spouses, so they go for maybe 1 month, 2 months without going back to their family. So you find they are the most client for the prostitution business. But also you find, I talk about the hotel. When you go to the hotels, you find there's somebody coming out of the office in the lunch break, they go to a hotel with a lady. So you find also somebody from the office can go to be a client. Also another thing, you find those in the streets, they're not from the tankers only. Somebody also in the streets they go through the streets and they take the proceeds from the streets. So tanker drivers are not the most, you find they are the highest percentage. And also maybe something else you can look, for example, in Kenya, for the COVID-19 disease, tanker drivers, they are the highest spreading COVID-19 in this country. Similarly to HIV, tanker drivers are the most high who spread HIV and AIDS in this country. So tanker drivers, they are most highly involved in prostitution business in this country.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much to Joseph for having me on the panel. So I'm going to be speaking today about a project that we're working on in Uganda. It's related to volunteering and displacement and how volunteering pathways affect the employability of young refugees there. It's a project funded by the 2018 Education and Skills GCRF call, and Northumbria is the leading university in it, and we're working in partnership with 2 institutes in Uganda, Uganda Martyrs University and Embarara University of Science and Technology, and Loughborough University. And I'm based at the Centre for International Development in Northumbria. I'm a research fellow in global challenges. Next slide, please. So I should just start off by saying we shortened the title of the project to REVU, which is Refugee Youth Volunteering Uganda. And I had hoped that this presentation, when I submitted the abstract, that we would have be able to discuss more about the first round of results from a large survey that we were going to do, but unfortunately that was put on hold due to COVID. So we're just about to start a big portion of our fieldwork. So this presentation is going to be more of an overview and just the kind of very preliminary findings from some stakeholder workshops we did, kind of what we're planning to do. So that's just a look at the team there. So there were 6 of us who put in the proposal originally from the different institutes, and then we have 2 postdocs who joined us after the project was funded. And the aim, as you can see there, is to understand whether volunteering by refugee youth in Uganda helps their skills acquisition and employability, and whether it reduces their inequalities. So we had 4 main questions in relation to this aim. So basically, we wanted to get a much more detailed picture about what volunteering looks like for young refugees in Uganda. And I should say that when we speak about young refugees, we mean from 15 to 25. And I should also caveat as well that I'm not an expert in volunteering. My research is more based in urban displacement. So we're taking turns to do different. So I apologize that you got stuck with me for this one. So I'll do my best to explain about volunteering, but there's other people on the team who have more expertise in it. So yeah, as I mentioned, the fieldwork is stopped at the moment, but our methodology includes, as I mentioned, some stakeholder workshops. We're just about to start a large-scale survey of about just over 1,500 people. Focus groups, we're going to use some photo voice diaries on a fairly small group, participatory mapping, and we're also going to do oral histories in relation to refugees' trajectory through volunteering, and the different paths it's taken them on, and the kind of the story that they've built up around volunteering. Next slide, please. So just to give an overview of where we're working, we have 4 case study areas. So we're based in Kampala and in 3 refugee settlements throughout the country: Nakival, Romanja, and Bidibidi. And you can see them not very well highlighted there, they're a bit small, but and we're looking at 4 different refugee groups, so Congolese, Somali, South Sudanese, and Burundian. And I'll come on to in a minute why we decided to do it that way. We're also working with a range of NGO partners. So you can see there Ugandan Red Cross, Jesuit Refugee Services, the Finnish Refugee Council, some Congolese-based NGOs, Yared and Ciota, which are both based in Kampala, and also the IFRC and AFARD. So they're helping us out in different parts of the project in relation to giving us advice on how we develop different methodologies, helping us gain access to different refugee groups, just almost acting as consultants on different aspects of the project, and they all have their own expertise with different groups in different regions. And the PI on the project, Matt, also has very strong connections with the International Federation of Red Cross, so they're very much will be involved in the dissemination of the results as well. Next slide, please. So just to give a bit of a background and context about the project itself. So one of the reasons we wanted to do this was that youth unemployment generally, both with Ugandans and the refugee population, is quite high in Uganda. And we wanted to look at volunteering and kind of unpick what can be very much North American or European ideas of what volunteering means. And it was particularly interesting for me, as somebody who doesn't have a background in volunteering, when we started a project, that we realized when we did the stakeholder workshops that one of the things we really need to do before we could even begin the fieldwork properly was kind of to unpick the definition of what volunteering means. Because when we went to speak with the different NGOs and different groups of people that we met, what they were describing to us as what we would have considered volunteering from the very much Western-centric approach of certainly what my idea of volunteering is, basically working for free, or they're what they were describing, they wouldn't define it in that way at all. So that's kind of been, now that our fieldwork isn't laid, we've been spending a bit more time kind of conceptually developing the ideas around what actually volunteering means for these different groups, and also trying to build a framework of unpicking the idea that volunteering might always necessarily be a positive experience, and trying to see if the kind of the popular assumptions that exist in the academic discourse around this are really stand up to scrutiny in the context of young refugees in Uganda specifically. Next slide, please. So phase one, as I said, we haven't done much fieldwork yet, but we've done some stakeholder workshops in Kampala and also the refugee settlements with a wide variety of civil society, government, and what really came out of this discussions at the time was, as I mentioned, the issues around the definition and how we needed to reconsider what our whole approach basically to the project. And just to give you an example, when we were developing the questions for the survey, we had to think about things like when we've always assumed that volunteering is a positive thing. For example, a lot of NGOs use volunteers to work essentially for free for them in various organizations in Uganda. This might actually be taking away paid work from other people who are now left out of that opportunity. And also in the case of, for example, refugees who are coming into the country who are already well educated and have a very high skill level, they might end up volunteering in positions that are actually they're underemployed essentially, and it's not helping them at all. So we want to kind of look more into how these actually play out in the different settlements and also across the different groups. So, for example, does it make a difference in terms of gender? We saw that, anecdotally from the people that we spoke, that there seems to be much less female volunteering than there is male volunteering, and also across the different groups. For example, that the Congolese refugees in Kampala seem to be in some ways better integrated and better networked than, for example, their Somali counterparts. Is that down to language? Is it down to education? Is it down to religion, for example? Is it a mixture of all these different things? And just to consider that, as well as other aspects, for example, the kind of the differences between the so-called formal and more informal ideas of volunteering. So, kind of the hierarchy of volunteering of, for example, those volunteering positions that require you to have literary skills, require you maybe to have a high school diploma, things like that, are in comparison to those where, for example, you're just working, maybe doing cleaning in your community or something like that. Are people judged differently based on the kind of volunteering they do? And also obviously, do the qualifications that they have or don't have then automatically stop them from accessing different opportunities? And we wanted to get a bit of a better picture about all of those questions. Next slide, please. So to help us as well with this kind of conceptual development, we've also engaged with some advisory boards, so an expert advisory board and also a citizens advisory board in each of the 4 settlements. And these are groups of young refugees who are from across the 4 different groups who we try and engage with fairly regularly when, for example, we're developing the survey, to ask questions like, is this kind of a question that we should be asking, or they can look over it, things like translations, different things that maybe we're missing from the whole overview of the project. So we try to engage with them quite regularly, and we set up a newsletter, and I've got guidance as well about things like ethical clearance and all the kind of administrative things around managing the project. And I think particularly the advisory board has been really helpful. For example, now we're looking to start up running the project, the survey again in the next few months. We've been trying to engage with the advisory board about, how will the people in the settlements react to if we decide to send out enumerators to do the data collection and that kind of engagement. So to kind of make sure that everyone is happy with what we're doing. Next slide, please. So these are just some of the a few examples of quotations that I have from the stakeholder workshops and from some of the key informant interviews that we've done so far, and some kind of scribbles from I was trying to develop the questions for the survey. And you'll see there some of what I mentioned about defined pathways, and also obviously the relationships between the institutions and the volunteers themselves. And I think one that's really important there that you can just see at the bottom is in relation to inequality, and whether volunteering, as I mentioned, enhances or exacerbates existing inequalities, and how it does that across the different groups, and what it means to work for free. Is there such a thing as really altruistic volunteering, where you can genuinely do something to help other people in your community or an organization, and without any expectation of any kind of benefit to yourself? And all of these kind of questions around this, and then obviously looking also at, particularly with, for example, the life histories and oral histories that we're going to do, the pathways that volunteering opens up to people are not, as the case may be, in terms of their kind of long-term employability, and factoring in, obviously in the case of refugees, the added dimension of the fact that they have refugee status, that they may not have a big support network in Uganda, and discrimination potentially, language difficulties, all of these kind of things, and taking that into account when we're hopefully at the end of the project we'll have enough data that we can examine across the 4 different groups and the 4 different settlements to see kind of a rich body of data about the differences between all of them. If you can just go to the next slide, please. So just in relation to the initial findings and emergent dialogues, as I mentioned, defining volunteering, kind of the inequalities, particularly as well questions around remuneration and reward. So what we found from kind of the initial interviews and data collection that we've done, there's questions about what some people consider remuneration. For example, is it something like money for lunch, or for example, being paid for your transport, or is it a per diem, is it a salary? There's all these different. We spent many hours when we were developing the survey, trying very hard to kind of really pinpoint the questions around what is the actual definition of payment, and all of these different words that are used, and what does it mean in this context, and that's been quite tricky, I think, and then we hope to kind of refine it a bit more when we do the pilot, to ensure that we've actually kind of covered all the different definitions around what remuneration and reward might mean, and also get kind of a more rich insight into kind of what the volunteers themselves consider to be acceptable, because obviously there's often a kind of unspoken problematic in some cases instance where volunteers can be very much exploited, even by NGOs where there are working to help them in the case of humanitarian organizations, but essentially they're a large pool of very cheap, at the best case, or completely free labor. And of course, the kind of quid pro quo is that, well, you get the experience, and maybe if you stay here for long enough, then you get a proper position as it was. But that is often, of course, not the case. So this needs to be considered in kind of the wider humanitarian landscape as well, about what does this huge body of very cheap or free labor mean for kind of how humanitarian operations work as well. And also as well, of course, they're mentioned about inclusion and identity, how volunteers see themselves. Obviously, it's often something to be proud of, that you're contributing to your community, you're helping out your neighbours, all of these kind of things, and how that fits into the discourse of why people decide to volunteer. Is it purely for, this is just kind of the more formal idea about, building my skills, or is it much more to do with the informal idea of, this needs to be done in my community, nobody's doing it, so I'm going to step in and help, that kind of, the conversations around that. And also in terms of agency, about how volunteers can really make a change, you know, in their immediate community. So I think particularly from our discussions with the Congolese NGOs that we're working with, I think that's a really good example where both of them were just refugees in their own communities who started doing things like, you know, teaching other people English, just helping them out with various different small things, and gradually over time have built a really amazing, well-networked, you know, groundbreaking NGO that's really making a lot of changes for their communities, and that was done. It's completely organically with very little, you know, or no outside help essentially, and to me at least, that's what I would consider a type of volunteering that we're speaking about here. But they wouldn't maybe have defined it in that term of volunteering as we use it in the kind of the Western sense. And just to finish off, I think what's really important as well is that one of the last quotes there, which is "the poor cannot volunteer," which is what one of the interviewees said to us, which I think is a really kind of interesting quotation, that for a certain group of people that's just not an option, or if they do volunteer, then there has to be something of benefit to them, because obviously they don't have the extra time or resources. And I mean, time is one of the, you know, really important points as well in terms of unequal access, and as I mentioned already, with females having a lot less time often than men to volunteer. So yeah, and in terms of the dialogues going forward, as I said, we're hoping to start main part of our field work in the next few months. So hopefully I'll have more if I come back next year to discuss in terms of our results. But going forward, we're just hoping to kind of unpick all the questions that I mentioned and kind of hopefully develop some kind of framework and kind of a richer data set of if and how volunteering makes a difference to the lives of the young refugees in Uganda. Next slide, please.
Thank you so much for your amazing presentation. These are very insightful issues that you seem to be exploring in a very seamless and effortless manner. I'm very eager to hear more with your field work, and also what your interviews and your maybe surveys might yield. So please, members of the audience who have any questions, kindly raise your hand and then I'll call you. In the meantime, perhaps we wait to see any raised hands. I have a question of my own. So first of all, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how your field work is conceptualized as a design. What will it entail? And then secondly, you alluded to the dynamics between Western volunteerism and the perception, and of course Westerners going to developed countries to volunteer, and then the notion of volunteering in the eyes or from the perception of locals in many developing and emerging countries. Maybe if you can speak to that in terms of maybe if you have any personal testimonies or individuals who you have interacted with and maybe shared their perspectives or experience, that would be interesting. But if not, I was just a little curious. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the fieldwork, as I said, we're hoping to do a large mobile phone survey, which is a survey of about 30 minutes, and that's just kind of providing the hopefully the data around, you know, how many people in each of the settlements volunteer, and just a general idea of what kind of volunteering they do, how many hours a week. So it's not a very detailed question, but it's to kind of get an overarching picture of volunteering in the country. And then we're going to do, I think it's 30 photo voice projects where refugees will have cameras for a month, come back and take photos of what they consider to be volunteering that they do, and we'll come back and analyze them. Then we have some participatory mapping sessions around the different types of volunteering that will go on in the settlements, and also we have the the kind of more in-depth life oral histories in relation to their volunteering work over the course of a number of years. And there might be one other thing, but I can't remember right now. So yeah, so it's kind of a it's quite a big project. So I think, considering the delays now, it'll probably take us another 2 years to finish all that. But hopefully at the end we'll have quite a, as far as I'm aware, it's going to be the biggest survey in relation to volunteering that's been done so far. So hopefully it can also kind of provide the basis for more further research going forward. And in terms of the volunteering discourse, I don't know if I'm probably the best person to speak to. As I said, I'm not an expert in the volunteering academic literature, but I certainly think that from kind of the preliminary discussions we've had with people, that there's definitely more to be examined and discussed in depth in relation to what is very, almost a colonial attitude of what people consider to be volunteering. And also, of course, I think there's also been a lot written already about the idea of the European or the white Westerner going over and landing in some place for a few weeks and then taking lots of photos on Instagram and saying how they're helping all the local people. Kind of this kind of narrative, which is really very far removed from what we're actually seeing on the ground in terms of obviously the refugee populations really building up their own structures and developing networks in Uganda, and doing it completely without any help from outside organizations, and because of that, a lot of times being actually much more successful in making a real change, and also a much longer lasting change as well.
Okay, thank you so much. That's very helpful. Well, I don't see any additional hands raised here, so I'll let you off for now, and then if any comments or questions come up later, I'll let you know. So thank you so much for your presentation. I will let you off the podium and then ask James to help me, and we'll bring Esther on the podium. So our next presenter is Esther.
My fellow colleagues at the DSA National Conference. My name is Esther Tolorojo, and I'm here to present a paper titled Analysis of Effects of Youth Migration and Agricultural Production in Rural Farming Households in Southwest Nigeria. Next slide, please. Like we know, migration is a complex phenomenon and a key component of livelihood strategies in rural households, which focus on minimizing risk and diversifying household income. There are many reasons why migration takes place, most especially rural-urban migration, with the rural youth migrating out of the rural areas to the urban areas. Nigeria is not an exception. Nigerian youth migrate out of their rural areas to the urban areas for so many reasons. Though literature has always concentrated its effort on internal migration, but this study focuses on the effect of internal migration of the youths from the rural areas to the urban area. Like we know in different studies, international migration has always been the main focus. And like I said earlier, this study addresses the root cause of internal migration of the youths from the rural areas to the urban areas. At household level, young members move to work outside the rural areas in order to diversify their risk. Next slide, please. Rural youths in Nigeria migrate in response to distress and lack of gainful employment and entrepreneurial opportunities in agriculture and related rural economic activities. Agriculture and rural development are central to the rate of rural outmigration to the urban areas by the young and energetic youths in Nigeria. The agricultural sector needs to be regenerated so as to engage the young energetic youths into agriculture as a way of increasing the global food production. Next slide, please. Hence, this study has put into place and also thought it right that there is a need to look into the reasons why there is a movement of the young energetic youths from the rural areas to the urban areas. As it is known in Nigeria, most of the food production takes place in the rural areas. Migration of these young youths from the rural areas has also placed a greater burden on the farmers. Once the young energetic youths move away from the rural areas, then the farming activities are left in the hands of the old, the young, and the aged, especially women in the rural areas. Also, labor becomes very expensive. As well, this reduces productivity, it reduces income, and this results to a fall in the standard of living of the rural community. Next slide, please. Based on this aforementioned, this study investigates the reasons of youth migration as well as the effects of youth migration on agricultural production in the rural area. Next slide, please. The main objective of this study is to analyze the effects of youth migration and agricultural production in rural farming areas in southwest Nigeria, with the following specific objectives. Number one, to describe the socio-economic characteristics of the respondents, to identify the causes of youth migration, to assess the perceived effects of youth migration on agricultural production, and to determine the level of correlation between migration and agricultural production. Next slide, please. The study area was southwest Nigeria, using Ogun and Osun states as representative sample of the southwest geopolitical zones in Nigeria. A multi-stage sampling technique was used, and 375 rural households were interviewed to carry out the study. The method of data analysis includes the descriptive statistics and the Pearson correlation. Next slide, please. The results from this study, as you can see on this first graph, shows us that majority of the household head remaining in the rural areas are males, with 84% of the respondents as male household heads, whereas we now have 16% of female-headed households. That is to tell us that majority of the households in the rural areas are headed by men, with a few by the women. Next slide, please. According to household size, majority of the interviewed households had between 5 to 8 persons as members of the households. That is to tell us that between 5 to 8 persons from the households in the rural areas, while we have more than 8 persons to have 5.7%. And this indicates that if we have more, for instance, men in the households, more energetic men will be available for agricultural labor. Next slide, please. The age distribution of the household heads. We have majority of the household heads falling between 51 and 60 years of age. This is to tell us that over an average of the interviewed households are between the ages of 51 and 60. And looking at the energy of a 51-year-old man working with crude traditional farming implements, what can he really do in a situation whereby farming is not mechanized in the rural areas? Yet we have this lot of people working on the farm with traditional implements and equipment on their farm. This is to tell us that the aged are the ones left in the rural communities to partake in farming activities. And what can they do? Looking at their strength, their vigor, vis-a-vis their age. This will inform us that agricultural production in these areas will definitely be low. Next slide, please. We have 51% of the households haven't completed primary school education, and we have a few of them having not attended any formal education. Next slide, please. Majority of the households interviewed, 92% precisely, were married. 6% of them were divorced or separated, while 2% of them were widowed. That tells us that the married people haven't had between 5 to 8 persons of household members can actually take up agricultural production as their livelihood activity. But this can be impeded when the ones that are supposed to stay behind leave the rural areas. Next slide, please. This table shows us the income sources of the rural dwellers in the study area, as well as their percentage income from each of their sources. We will find out here that 60% of their total household income is from farm income. You have 16% from remittances, because some of them already have migrants in their households. 13% from off-farm activities, 3% from employment, self-employment, and you have 6.3% from other sources of income. Next slide, please. Distribution of the water source and the sanitary level in the rural area tells us that majority of them use the covered well, and the covered pit as their toilet facility. Meanwhile, the kerosene stove is still being used as their cooking fuel, where we have a handful of the respondents not connected to electricity in the rural area. Next slide, please. Now, looking at the distribution of farming activities engaged in by the youths in the rural areas. Majority of the men are always engaged in land clearing, in harvesting, in planting, but we have an average of the male involved in weeding. But it should be noted that the processing of agricultural products activities are done mostly by the female gender. Next slide, please. Looking at the reasons why the youths have migrated out of the rural areas, there are various reasons, diverse reasons, why the youths in this study area have migrated out. Topmost is the search for better wage employment. Since they cannot find higher level of income in agricultural production alone in the rural area, hence they move out of the rural areas and go to the urban areas for search of better employment. The next is the perceived family poverty status. Some of the household heads reported that because the family is poor, they have to send out 2 or 3 members of their households to go and search for better opportunities, and whereby remitting money back to the households for a higher standard of living. Other reasons are due to unemployment. Some move out due to lack of good road network in the community. Some of the youth move out due to relocation because of marriage. These are the various reasons why the youth in the study areas have migrated from their rural areas. Next slide, please. This graph tells us the number of youth that have migrated out of each household in the rural study area. And we have 92% having households that have migrated from them to be between 1 and 2 persons. So we have 1 or 2 persons moving out of the rural household in search for better wage employment. Next slide, please. This graph tells us that 90% of the youth migrants were male, while 9% of them were female. This corroborates the fact that when the young men leave the rural areas, agricultural production will be hampered, labor will be reduced, hence income from agricultural production will be reduced. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The effects of migration on agricultural production in the rural areas are stated below. We have 98% of loss of family and hired agricultural labor force as one of the major effects, as well as reduction in agricultural production. 98.7% of the interviewed household heads responded that reduction in agricultural production is one of the major effects that youth migration have caused on agricultural production in the rural area. We also have reduction in population of the members of the community. You have underdevelopment of the community. We have reduction in household size. We have increase in poverty status of household members that are left behind, as well as reduction in the farm size cultivated. Reduction in farm size cultivated will happen because those that are to help the aged work on their farm have left the rural areas. Hence, this will lead to reduction in agricultural production, as well as a reduction in agricultural income. Next slide, please. A correlation analysis, Pearson correlation analysis, help us to find out that there is a correlation between the youth migration and the level of agricultural production, with a coefficient of determinant of 59%, which implies that youth migration have caused about 59% in reduction in agricultural production in southwest Nigeria. This negative but significant relationship indicates that as more of the energetic youth migrate from the rural areas, reduction in agricultural production will also be on the decline. Next slide, please. Therefore, this study concludes that leaving the farming activities in the hands of women and aged people will cause a drastic reduction in the level of food production in the rural communities. And thus, the study recommends that provision of rural infrastructure, both in the health, education, water, potable water, in the rural areas should be carried out as a way of retaining the young, energetic youth in food production in the rural areas. Also, a reduction in the development gaps between the rural and the urban centers should be closed. Let both the rural and the urban centers be developed. If they are developed, the youth will not move out of the rural areas to the urban areas. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Esther, for your presentation. Hello, Esther, can you please hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, please. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. So, and I want to thank the panelists and the audience for being so patient. You know, the technology is always,
Thank you.
as you may have observed. So we would like to have some questions for Esther, please. May I please see if you have a question by your clicking on your raised hand button so that we can call you. So I see a hand raised. So I'll bring Neil onto the podium. I hope it works. I'm not sure why. Okay, yes, it's working. Hi, Neil.
Yeah. Hi.
Please, you have the podium. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thanks very much. And very interesting presentation from Esther, but also the other presentations as well. I enjoyed very much listening to them. It's a question to Esther, maybe being a little bit provocative, but looking at the history of many countries which have moved from being primarily agrarian to more, we say, industrial-oriented, industrial-based economies, there is a situation where you have to move away from small-scale production. You have to see a consolidation of land holdings, and you actually have to see a movement of population very often into urban areas. So this may begin with youth, but it may also then become families as maybe households in rural areas become, should we say, non-functional in a number of ways, economic, socially, et cetera, et cetera. It's something we see in Ethiopia at the moment, for instance. And at one level, we see a very strong reaction against this. It's about clearing lands, moving populations away from where they traditionally have grazed their cattle or else had some form of cultivation. And instead you see new forms of not least external investment, both within Ethiopia and from outside Ethiopia, creating commercial agriculture. Now, obviously this has a high cost. But on the other hand, it's also a basis for actually beginning to create a different type of economy. And if you are having, should we say, growth of urban areas, you also need to secure cheap food supplies for those living in urban areas. Now, this is part of a much larger discussion, but I was just wondering, is the present situation sustainable? Isn't there something which operates perhaps at a higher level in terms of the national economy that we also have to be aware of? So it may be that we don't maybe advocate policies to try and keep people in rural areas, and here I'm being provocative, but we actually try to advocate for policies which ease their passage to other locations. In other words, turning mobility into a positive attribute, a positive action, rather than seeing it as a negative action.
Thank you so much, Neil. Esther, you may please respond to Neil's.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. Well, the situation in Nigeria, especially in rural areas, has been the same. Farming here is not mechanized and is not commercialized. So you still find small, older farmers in rural areas in Nigeria. You cannot compare the small rural farmers here with those of Ethiopia. If you will just take a visit down to rural areas in Nigeria and see how farming is being done, you will be amazed that these people are producing so much from the little crude traditional equipment that they still use. I agree with you that we should try to look at the positive implication of mobility into the urban areas, though food production is mostly done in the rural areas. So there is still need for these farmers to stay in the rural areas, but if only the government can improve what is being given to them and distributed to them, what they use on their farm, then you find out that majority of them won't have to leave the rural areas. They will stay in the rural areas and produce more food. So it's a different ball game in Nigeria and Ethiopia. Neil, I would just like you to visit Nigeria and see our farming.
I wasn't implying that it was the same. I was trying to make a more general point because.
Yeah, I know, I get.
But also, I agree. But I noticed that, for instance, you pushed the points about improving service provision, water, sanitation, education, infrastructure. Of course, all that's important. But if you improve education, we've seen in many countries, in fact, that educated young people don't necessarily want to stay in farming. They want to go into other areas, into, should we say, areas which they feel their education. And I think this came out in a couple of presentations, yours as well, showing that education and is one of the bases. Well, there is a correlation. We don't know if there's a causation between education and mobility, and particularly mobility into other areas for other types of employment. So in many ways, it's not just about trying to make the farming better. It's also about trying to create other types of economic, should we say, local economic development in rural and semi-urban areas, probably. And it may well be linked to the agrarian economy in terms of processing and things like this, but I mean, we cannot simply stay with small-scale agriculture. Some people would argue, not least economists. I don't know if others have views on this.
Right. Esther, do you have a response to Neil's? Yes, please feel free. Go ahead.
Okay, please. Like what Neil said, is good because once people are educated, they will want to move out of agriculture and farming. But even with your education, there are other sectors under agriculture that you can engage in. You have the food processing, you have the value chain. So your education does not stop you from farming. Your education will improve on your farming skills. Some people go into school to study agriculture and they see the need to modernize agriculture, commercialize agriculture, and even bring agriculture into the IT model. So there are different ways whereby education gives a good, significant correlation with agriculture. I agree with Neil. So it's not that they are being educated to leave farming. No, they are being educated in order to have a different view of what farming should look like, a different methodology, new innovation. Education will help you and assist you with new technologies, new innovation, adapting new technologies, new modalities on the farm. So education is also key to farming, both in rural, semi-urban, and urban areas. Am I good? Is it okay?
Yeah, that sounds great, and also, of course, important in that respect. So there is a question by Alice. Alice was going to. So Alice, you have a series of questions. Why don't I bring you up instead so that you can pose them directly instead of reading them? So let's see if you can bring Alice on the podium. Hi, Alice. Hello, Alice. Please go ahead with your amazing questions. I thought it would be great to have you interact with the speaker. It feels better that way. So apologies for bringing you, I'll put you on the spot.
No problem. So with the person who asked the previous questions, I also had the same thoughts, whether this kind of production is sustainable. Because I don't know what the situation is, but I'm guessing.
Alice, please, can you speak up? I can barely hear you.
Alice, okay. Get a little close to your microphone. Yeah, or your.
I can hear.
Yeah. Yes. Is it better now?
A little more.
Esther, can you?
Hello, Alice.
Yeah, hello. Can you?
Yeah, she's trying to adjust her microphone. Yeah.
Okay.
Wow. I hope you can hear. But I was wondering about the sustainability of the farming, seeing as there is a lot of land fragmentation, And the question I had was, what kind of crops are grown there? Is there an option for value addition? Because I know if small farmers are not organized, if they're not in groups, then it's hard to access the markets.
Good. So, so Esther, I hope you heard most of the questions, most of Alice's question. If not, I can repeat part of it for you.
Okay, please, can you repeat, please?
So I believe she's referring to the fact that what crops are there for value addition? I think that's the first part of the core of the first part of the question. Yeah.
Okay, you have mostly staple foods. They have staple foods that they can easily have value addition to. They have staple foods that you can add value to. And even if there is land fragmentation, you can easily bring the farmers together, do a co-integration, and then do a marketing that will bring all farmers together and sell their product, maybe at a point, or gather their products in a particular place, and it's been taken to the central market.
Okay. Right. Alice, I think you seem to have a second part of your question, or a third part.
I don't know which one I had posted, but there's a presentation I had yesterday. I think that one was based in Ghana, and there was a lot of discrepancies with some areas have very strong farmer organizations, while others are not as strong because vested interests come in. So also the feasibility of farmer organizations, because at the end, I mean, it's a bit hard not to be cynical, seeing as there has been so much problems with getting the farmers into productive livelihoods. And so I was wondering, are there any areas where this has worked? Are there any success stories in those areas?
Okay, great. So sorry, I have to repeat this due to the sound level. So Esther, Alice is wondering if you have any evidence or examples of successful farmer organizations that have been able to sustainably operated together and yielded maybe success stories in your experience.
Yes, you have some farmer cooperatives. You have some farmers coming together as cooperatives. They farm together. They do corporate farming, and at the end of the day, there's a corporate marketing. And there are some organizations that normally go to these corporate, we call them like cooperative farmers, and buy their produce, especially those that are into cassava, into maize, majorly cassava and maize. Because of the study area, a lot of cassava and maize has been produced there. So you have some industries coming into this cooperative farming association to help them out in buying their produce. So you have some of them.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Alice.
Great, Alice, you're okay? Happy with your questions? Satisfied? Good. Thank you so much, Alice. Right. So we'll take, I believe, thank you. So we'll take our next question from Raj. Raj, I'll put Raj up on the podium so that you can post your question to please go ahead.
Yeah. I want to first appreciate Esther for that excellent presentation.
Thank you.
However, I have some observations, maybe by the fact that I'm also a Nigerian. I reside in Lagos. I'm a lecturer in LASU, Lagos State University. Probably this will inform why I have some information. There was a time that the Lagos State government and Kebbi State government went into collaboration, and they end up having a rice production called lake rice.
Rice, yes.
The Lagos State government of recent came up with this idea of returning that fantastic agricultural production policy back to the rural sector, back to the youth in the rural area. And as a result of this, they stopped the collaboration between Lagos State and Kebbi State. And as we speak, I know of a particular area within Lagos State along Ikorodu Epe axis where lands were given to the youth for agricultural products. Do you get it now? So my question is, how does this kind of policy come to play in your study? That is one. Secondly, I'm also aware that the government of Oyo State are also doing a very similar thing when it comes to agricultural sector. It's not about the location of where the agriculture is taking place now. It's about going back to the youth, taking agriculture back to the youth and ensure that the youth are engaged either in large quantity or small quantity. Like I said, I'm aware that Oyo State is doing the same thing, and I'm also aware that Osun State too is also doing the same thing. So the question is, how does these government policies come to play in your study?
Okay. Hello, Raji.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I can hear you.
Very clear.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Raji. Yes, I'm aware of the Lake Rice thing, and presently, even Ogun State, that is the study area, is also doing the same thing. As at last year, they started with the youth by giving them parcels of land to cultivate, and some were even given birds to raise up to the point of sale. Some were given feed, some fertilizer. Now the youths are now being engaged. It is now the youths are being engaged in farming. So after the first phase of their what will I call it, of the survey, or of their farming period, we can now go back and now take an investigation of what really has happened. As if, will what the government have done now, has it really made them to make up their minds to stay in farming and stay in the rural area or not? That will be another study for another day. But from this study, what we engaged in, or what we did, were to look out for those that had migrants in their households and how that has affected their own livelihood. Now, the second thing is, I know Ogun State is into it, giving parcels of land along the Lekki way that you talked about. I know of that, so I'm aware of that. But right now, we can't say we want to measure until after we hear like a success story from them. So let us give it a year or two and let us see what the youth will have to say about it. It is then we can now measure the pre and the post of what the government intervention has done to the youth.
Right. Esther, thank you very much for that powerful response. You sounded like the Minister of Agriculture and Development.
No, I'm only a lecturer. I'm a lecturer. Okay, let me introduce myself. I'm a lecturer in the Federal University of Agriculture, Abeokuta, Ogun State.
Yes, I know that. So I'm not mistaking you. I'm just predicting maybe a future possibility.
Thank you, Joseph.
All right, so you're welcome. Okay, so we want to thank you all. Thank you very much, Raji, for your question. Of course, thanks to everyone who has asked a question or been attentive and patient and listened to our presentations. I believe They've been very inspiring and also insightful in that regard. And so we want to say a big thank you to everyone for making time, submitting your abstract to our panel, and of course, ensure following all the numerous email instructions, and then doing your best to keep the time, etc. And of course, being patient with our technological systems as we all try to learn navigating Shindig and making it work. So I believe it's been a successful panel. I believe it's got an ongoing successful conference as well. And we'd like you to encourage you to enjoy the conference and the rest of the sessions that you may opt to participate in. Our time is quite exhausted in this regard. So we wouldn't necessarily have room for any continued conversation regarding our book projects, but I would recommend that maybe we set up by email, we'll agree on the dates and be a time, we set up a Zoom session, and then maybe have an open conversation for that matter for those those of us who might be interested. Now that we've heard each other's presentations, we can be able to be more pragmatic with regards to where each of us is with respect to our particular projects. And if we want to be part of the book projects, what will be maybe the appropriate timelines which will make it feasible for our respective teams to be involved in such an initiative, because the value of such a project is being able to have everyone or as many of us as possible who might be interested to join, and also having timelines that are workable in terms of pragmatic timelines. I'm also mindful of the fact that as part of today's session, we've learned about some presenters or some papers or projects that are still ongoing or are waiting to have field work dimensions started in that regard. So we can take those into account, and I can share some of these updates with the publishing editor if, for example, you are interested, but you need to have things, you can't submit anything until maybe a particular timeline because of impending field work. I'm sure we'd like to know that, and we can consider the possibilities and whether it works, because I think each of us will need time anyway to either put together a manuscript or analyze some data or do some review or whichever submission we will want to opt for. So please, let's kindly think about this. I want us to have time to consult with our project teams and colleagues, and maybe I'll send an email next week, thereabouts, when we've all had enough time to breathe and reflect and maybe do some consultation, and then we can have an informal session on conversation, just talking about what we may have in mind and interest, etc. So I want to make it very flexible and also more convenient as much as one might want to. But if for any reason you are also not interested, you are absolutely welcome to let us know. There's no pressure at all. So on that note, I would like us to wrap up because we've been on for a while, and I think our technical support staff needs to go for another session. So he might have to leave. So I think we will have to consider bringing this to a close. So I'll finally want to say thank you all very much. It's been a great pleasure meeting you. We've had the opportunity of having the informal session for those who were able to join. And then today, for those who we're getting to meet for the first time, and getting to learn about each other's work is a wonderful opportunity indeed. So thanks again for your excellent work, and want to encourage you to stay safe, be well, and then I'll be in touch by email.